False memory syndrome. You sit at a kitchen table, sunlight pooling across the wood, the smell of coffee rising like a quiet anchor to the morning. Across from you, a friend laughs and reminds you of that trip you took together years ago. The broken-down car, the rain, the way you both stumbled through the mud, soaking wet, laughing. The memory blooms inside you. You can feel the cold rain again. You remember the sound of it drumming on the windshield. You nod, smile, even add details. It happened. You were there. Except you weren't. False memory syndrome doesn't just suggest that memories can be fuzzy. It suggests something far more unsettling. Entire scenes of your life, events you would swear under oath really happened, might never have existed at all. The mind doesn't just misplace details. Sometimes it invents whole realities. And once a false memory roots itself, it feels no different from the truth. It doesn't take hypnosis or elaborate trickery to create false memories. Everyday conversations, leading questions, emotional suggestions, they're enough. A childhood story told often enough becomes your memory, even if you never lived it. A photograph half-glimpsed folds itself into your past. A dream, vivid and haunting, welds itself onto real history. And once your brain accepts the story, it begins to fill in the missing pieces, textures, smells, emotions, until the fiction becomes a living part of you. Psychologists like Elizabeth Loftus have shown how disturbingly easy it is to implant false memories. In one study, people were convinced they'd been lost in a mall as children, despite it never happening. Some even invented elaborate details about the terror they felt in the stranger who helped them. If something so minor can be fabricated, what about the bigger things? What about the moments that shaped you? The betrayals, the triumphs, the regrets that define your life? How much of who you think you are is built on memories that might never have happened? And if memory is a house where fiction and truth live side by side, indistinguishable, then what happens to identity itself? Who are you if your past can be rewritten without your consent? Maybe we are not made of what truly happened. Maybe we are made of what we believe happened. And maybe somewhere deep inside, memory isn't a mirror at all, but a canvas, painted and repainted, not to preserve truth but to preserve meaning, even if that meaning was never real. Misinformation Effect. You watch the crash unfold from the sidewalk, the screech of tires, the shattering glass, the stunned silence that follows. Hours later, when the police question you, you tell them about the stop sign the driver ran. You can still see it clearly in your mind, the red octagon, the bold white letters. But there was no stop sign. Misinformation had already taken root. The misinformation effect is not about lies told deliberately. It's about how fragile memory is, how easily it absorbs suggestion, distortion, and error until it no longer resembles the original event. When new information is introduced, even subtly, even innocently, the mind doesn't just add it as a separate note, it rewrites the past to include it. Studies have shown how easily this happens. Show people footage of a car accident, then later ask them, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? The word smashed alone is enough to inflate speed estimates and even plant false memories of broken glass that was never there. Change one word, and you change history. The brain doesn't archive memories like files in a cabinet. Every time you recall something, you recreate it, pulling fragments together, smoothing edges, filling gaps, and when you do, outside influences seep in. The way a question is phrased, the expressions on other people's faces, stray comments that nudge your mind without you noticing. It's not deception, it's reconstruction. And if a small nudge can reshape a memory of something you witnessed, what about the larger tapestries you weave from stories, photographs, news, or conversation? How much of what you remember about childhood, relationships, even your own identity has been altered without your consent? Worse still, once a memory has been contaminated, you can't scrub it clean. The new version feels just as real, just as vivid, just as emotionally charged as the original. We like to believe our memories are sacred, that they are the one true thread tying us to the past. But memory is less a record than a painting, one that anyone, even strangers, can smudge with the lightest touch. And if your memories can be rewritten without your permission, then the past, the foundation of who you think you are, may be far less stable than it seems. Maybe the real danger isn't that we forget. Maybe the real danger is that we remember wrongly and never realize it. Change blindness. You walk into a familiar room. The chair is in the corner. The lamp tilts at its usual angle. The painting hangs just slightly askew. You blink, turn away for a moment, and when you look back, something is different. But you can't say what. You stare, retracing the walls, the shadows, the furniture, searching for the disturbance your mind feels but cannot name. The human mind loves to believe it captures everything, every detail, every flicker of light, every shift in the world around it. We pride ourselves on our attention, our alertness, but change blindness reveals a humbling truth. We notice far less than we think. Reality does not pour into our senses like water into a glass. It is selected, filtered, and then assembled, piece by piece, into the illusion of completeness. In one famous experiment, researchers staged a simple scene. A man asked strangers for directions. During the conversation, workmen carrying a door rudely passed between them, and in that instant, the man was swapped for another. A different face, a different voice. And most people never noticed. They continued speaking as if nothing had changed. Our minds aren't video cameras. They're painters, brushing in only the broad strokes they expect to see. We prioritize what feels important, faces we're speaking to, dangers in our path, and blur the rest into an assumed background. Change blindness isn't about distraction. It's about how deeply our expectations sculpt reality. If a detail fits the story we already believe, we don't question it. If it shifts quietly, we often miss it completely. And if something as simple as a different person can slip past unnoticed, what else might we be blind to? How many moments of significance dissolve into the background of a life we think we're fully living? Maybe the world around you, even now, is shifting, and you are gliding across it without realizing the floor has changed beneath your feet. Change blindness forces an unsettling reflection. What else have you failed to notice? Not because you weren't looking, but because you didn't expect change to happen at all. Maybe what you see isn't reality. Maybe it's just the version of reality your mind finds easiest to accept. Inattentional blindness. You sit in a crowded room, focused on a conversation. The hum of voices surrounds you, glasses clink, a door swings open and shut. A man in a bright red coat walks directly through the center of the room, and you never see him. This is not distraction. It's something deeper, a phenomenon known as inattentional blindness, where your mind, fully occupied with one task, becomes blind to everything else. The most famous experiment is almost absurd in its simplicity. Participants were asked to count the number of times players in white shirts passed a basketball. Focused intensely on the task, nearly half failed to notice a person in a full gorilla costume walk through the scene, beat its chest, and stroll off screen. Not at the edge, right through the middle. The conclusion is unsettling. We do not see with our eyes alone. We see with attention, and attention by its nature is selective. We are not cameras, passively recording everything. We are sculptors, carving away the irrelevant, the ordinary, the invisible. What we fail to notice isn't lost in distance or darkness. It slips away because we never granted it a place in our focus. Attention builds invisible walls, walls that protect us from overload, but also hide vast parts of reality. The more we narrow our gaze, the more the world outside our focus fades to nothing. Inattentional blindness isn't a flaw, it's survival. A mind that noticed every flicker would be paralyzed. Focus gives clarity, but clarity demands sacrifice. How many silent warnings have passed you by? How many gestures of kindness? How many signs you were searching for, but missed because you were looking somewhere else? Maybe the most important things don't scream for our attention. Maybe they slip by quiet and unnoticed while we chase what we're already prepared to see. And if the unseen can walk straight through your vision, waving its arms, shouting its presence, and still be invisible, what else might be happening right now? What worlds could exist just beyond the narrow beam of your attention, hidden, waiting, alive as you move forward, never even knowing they were there? Choice blindness. You walk into a small boutique, looking for a gift. After careful thought, you pick a deep blue scarf, simple, elegant, exactly what you wanted. The clerk smiles, wraps it for you, but when you open the package later, you find a red one instead. You frown, confused. But a strange thing happens. Instead of outrage, you tell yourself the red one is fine, maybe even better. You're sure you chose it, you just forgot. Choice blindness is the unsettling phenomenon where people fail to notice a mismatch between their intention and the outcome, and even go so far as to rationalize the choice they never made. Our minds crave coherence. Faced with a contradiction, they don't rebel. They rewrite. In experiments, participants were asked to choose between two faces, which person they found more attractive. But sometimes, without warning, researchers swapped the photo after the choice. Participants were then asked why they preferred the new face. And most didn't notice the swap at all. They offered confident, detailed explanations for a choice they never actually made. The implications are profound. We believe our decisions are deliberate, our preferences stable, but choice blindness suggests otherwise. Our sense of agency is not just fragile, it's negotiable. When reality shifts beneath our feet, the mind doesn't raise an alarm. It quietly patches the seams, smoothing over inconsistencies, preserving the illusion of steady control. We don't notice the swap, we defend it. And if such a blatant change can slip past us unnoticed, what else might be shifting in the background, without our awareness, without our permission? Maybe you didn't love that idea or person or path as much as you think. Maybe you adapted to a choice you didn't even make. Choice blindness forces us to confront a bitter question. Are we truly the authors of our preferences, or are we passengers, narrating whatever path the moment hands us, believing it was ours all along? Maybe the mind isn't interested in being right. Maybe it's interested in feeling consistent. And sometimes that means defending a stranger's choice as if it were your own. Illusory correlation. You hear about a violent crime on the evening news. The reporter mentions that the suspect belongs to a certain group, a nationality, a profession, a lifestyle. Without realizing it, a link begins to form in your mind, a pattern, a silent judgment. One event becomes a symbol for many. Even if the evidence is thin, even if reason would tell you otherwise. This is the quiet machinery of illusory correlation, the mind's tendency to perceive connections where none exist. We see patterns, links, causations between things that are merely coincidental or statistically meaningless. And once the illusion forms, it shapes how we interpret every future event. The mind is built to recognize patterns, to find meaning in chaos. It's a survival instinct as old as time. Hear a rustle in the grass and assume it's a predator rather than the wind, and you live another day. But in the modern world, that same instinct can turn sideways. It stitches together unrelated facts, exaggerates associations, and carves certainty from randomness. In classic studies, participants were shown fake medical records linking imaginary diseases to various symptoms. When certain rare symptoms were mentioned alongside the disease, even if no real relationship existed, people remembered them as strongly correlated. The mind inflated the connection simply because it was vivid, unusual, or emotionally charged. Illusory correlation doesn't whisper, it wires itself into beliefs, stereotypes, superstitions. It convinces us that a lucky charm caused a victory, that a single anecdote proves a general rule, that those people are always a certain way because of one striking memory. And once those false patterns set in, they're painfully difficult to untangle. Every confirming example feels like proof. Every contradiction fades into irrelevance. We don't just see the pattern, we defend it. Maybe the connections you believe in most fervently were never real. Maybe they were stitched together by a mind desperate to make sense of an indifferent world. Illusory correlation is a reminder that what feels obvious is often a trick, that certainty can be born not from truth, but from the mind's fear of the unknown. And if reality is quieter than our desperate patterns suggest, then what else have we imagined into existence just to feel like we understand? Apophenia. A radio crackles with static late at night. Through the hiss and hum, you hear something, a faint voice, a whisper threading itself between the noise. You lean closer, heart quickening, straining to make sense of it. Words seem to form, messages shimmer just beyond reach. But maybe there was nothing there at all. This is apophenia, the mind's restless hunger for meaning, spinning order out of chaos, even when no true pattern exists. Apophenia is more than superstition. It is a deep, primal reflex, an evolutionary inheritance from a time when finding meaning, even false meaning, could mean survival. A shadow that might be a predator. A flicker of light that might signal fire. Better to see connections that aren't there than to miss the ones that could cost you your life. But in the modern world, that reflex turns inward. We connect scattered events, unrelated signals, random noises, and shape them into grand designs. A coincidence becomes a cosmic sign. Random numbers on a clock feel like secret messages. A dream about a lost friend feels like a prophecy. Apophenia doesn't discriminate. It touches gamblers who see winning streaks where none exist. It haunts conspiracy theorists who stitch unrelated facts into intricate webs. It whispers to artists who find entire worlds inside splatters of paint. The mind is uncomfortable with randomness. Silence begs to be filled. Chaos begs to be named. And so we invent stories, patterns, meanings, all stitched together with a certainty that often feels more real than reality itself. What if that sign you saw was just noise? What if the connection you feel between events is nothing more than the mind's way of soothing itself against the vast indifference of chance? Apophenia reminds us that not every pattern is a message. Not every coincidence is a signal. Sometimes the universe is not speaking to us. Sometimes the radio crackles simply because it does. But even knowing this, would you really want a world without hidden meanings? Would you want to live in a place where every rustle in the leaves, every whisper in the dark, every glimpse of something almost seen meant absolutely nothing at all? Maybe the human mind needs its ghosts. Maybe in a silent universe, it's better to dream that someone or something is whispering back. Pareidolia. You lie back on a hill and stare at the sky. A slow drift of clouds passes overhead. In one, you see a lion, jaws stretched wide. In another, a sleeping giant. You laugh, pointing them out to a friend. They see them too. It feels obvious, as if the sky itself is telling a story. But the shapes were never there. Pareidolia is the tendency to perceive familiar patterns, especially faces, animals, or objects, where none exist. It's why we see figures in the clouds, faces on the moon, a phantom form in a swirl of wood grain. The mind does not tolerate empty randomness. It wants the world to look back at us. Our brains are wired to recognize faces above all else. A flash of eyes and a mouth, even suggested by shadows or random marks, triggers deep emotional circuits built for connection, protection, and survival. In ancient forests, seeing a face behind the leaves could mean the difference between life and death. Our ancestors who were quicker to detect patterns, even false ones, were the ones who lived. But this same reflex now paints meaning onto everything. Religious icons appear in the burn marks on toast. Ghostly faces peer from the grainy static of old television sets. A trick of light on a dusty window becomes a messenger from beyond. In 1976, NASA's Viking 1 orbiter photographed the surface of Mars, and the world saw a face staring back from the Cydonia region. It looked unmistakable, like a carved monument, evidence of ancient intelligence. Scientists later showed it was nothing more than a trick of lighting and resolution. But the story had already taken root. We don't just see, we need to see. Pareidolia isn't just about faces. It's about finding familiarity in the unfamiliar, stitching comfort into the raw fabric of existence. In a chaotic universe, it's a small rebellion, to find something known inside the unknown, to believe, even for a moment, that the world is not silent or blind. But if the face in the clouds was never real, what about the other patterns we trust? The silent looks, the signs we swear we saw, the meaning we build from chance impressions. Maybe much of what feels profound is just the mind drawing faces on the blank walls of the universe, because an empty sky is too much to bear. And if we can find faces in mist and meaning in static, what happens when we try to share that vision with others, and they don't see it at all? Because the next trap isn't about seeing too little, it's about knowing too much and forgetting what it's like not to. Curse of knowledge. You sit at a desk, a math textbook open before you, staring at a problem that refuses to make sense. Across from you, your teacher explains it again, this time a little slower, a little louder, but the numbers still blur together. To them, the answer is obvious, the steps so automatic they can't remember how it ever felt confusing. They lean over, tapping the page with growing impatience, puzzled by your blank stare. And in that moment, the gap between knowing and not knowing feels like a canyon, silent, invisible, but impossibly wide. This is the curse of knowledge, the invisible barrier that rises once you understand something so well that you forget what it's like to be without that understanding. It's a simple, quiet trap. When you know the answer to a puzzle, the puzzle no longer feels hard. When you understand a concept deeply, you underestimate how confusing it seems to someone encountering it for the first time. Knowledge reshapes perception and then hides the fact that it has. Studies show how deeply this curse runs. In a famous experiment, participants were asked to tap out the rhythm of well-known songs, "Happy Birthday, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star," on a table while others tried to guess the tune. Tappers predicted their partners would easily recognize the melody. After all, it was so clear to them, but listeners could barely guess correctly. What sounded obvious to the tapper was indistinguishable noise to everyone else. The curse isn't arrogance, it's blindness. Once an idea becomes second nature, you can't unlearn it. You can't truly recreate the confusion, the hesitation, the groping in the dark that came before understanding. This plays out everywhere in teaching, where experts struggle to explain basic concepts because they've forgotten how they once struggled. In communication, where people talk past each other because their reference points no longer align. Even in relationships, where someone assumes their meaning is clear because it feels clear inside their own head. Knowledge builds beautiful structures in the mind, but it also builds walls. Walls that separate you not just from ignorance, but from empathy. Maybe the hardest thing about wisdom isn't gaining it. Maybe it's remembering what it felt like to live without it. And once you forget what it's like to be unsure, to be lost, you risk becoming something worse than ignorant. You risk becoming unreachable. Because when knowledge blinds you to the struggle of seeing, you miss how hard it still is for others to find their way. And if understanding can turn into isolation, then in the next trap, we see something even stranger. How a single glimpse of success can spiral into a dangerous illusion of certainty. Hot hand fallacy. The crowd roars as the basketball leaves the player's fingertips and sinks through the net without touching the rim. Another shot, another clean score. The fans can feel it, and so can he. He's on fire. Every time the ball touches his hands, hope ignites. His teammates pass to him again and again, convinced the streak will continue. It feels inevitable, but it isn't. This is the hot hand fallacy, the powerful illusion that success breeds more success in a way that defies probability. Once we witness a streak, we believe it has a momentum of its own, that a hidden force is carrying it forward. Skill matters, of course, but the fallacy arises when we mistake random clustering, an ordinary feature of chance, for an unstoppable role. The term was born from a study in the 1980s, where researchers found that, contrary to popular belief, basketball players weren't significantly more likely to score after a hit than after a miss. The hot hand was mostly an illusion, an emotional narrative superimposed onto random sequences. Later studies refined and challenged these findings, but the core insight remained. Our minds are built to see streaks as meaningful, even when they're not. It isn't just sports. Investors throw money at stocks that have been rising, believing the rise will continue. Gamblers bet heavily on a winning player at the roulette table, convinced their luck will hold. Even in everyday life, we trust a string of good days as a sign that fortune has changed, ignoring how easily randomness can mimic destiny. The hot hand fallacy feels good because it taps into our craving for patterns and control. We want to believe that momentum is real, that we can ride it like a wave if we spot it early enough. A world where success comes in self-reinforcing bursts feels kinder, more navigable than a world ruled by cold, indifferent chance. But streaks are often just patterns seen in hindsight, a story woven after the fact. Randomness clusters naturally. Coins flip heads several times in a row without magic. Players score multiple shots in a game without tapping into hidden reserves of fire. Maybe the danger isn't believing in streaks. Maybe it's building our hopes and our strategies on the mistaken idea that fortune must obey momentum. And if the mind can so easily invent momentum where none exists, then what happens when it starts to believe that losses must balance out wins? In the next trap, we meet the dangerous cousin of the hot hand, a fallacy that whispers that after a string of bad luck, a win is due. Gambler's fallacy. The roulette wheel spins, a blur of red and black. The little white ball bounces, rattles, and lands. Black again. A murmur rises through the casino. 5 blacks in a row. Players crowd the table, stacking chips on red. It's obvious. They whisper, red is due. It has to be. But it doesn't. This is the gambler's fallacy. The belief that after a run of one outcome, the opposite is bound to happen. That randomness has a memory. That luck must even itself out. That the universe keeps a secret ledger to balance wins and losses. In truth, each spin of the wheel is independent. The ball has no memory. It doesn't know what came before. 5 blacks, 10 blacks, 20 blacks in a row, the odds for red on the next spin remain exactly the same. But the mind resists this. It aches for fairness. It longs for balance. The gambler's fallacy is not just a casino trick. It creeps into everyday life. You hesitate to trust a streak of bad news, thinking good fortune must be around the corner. You hold on to failing investments, convinced a turnaround is overdue. You stay in a crumbling relationship, hoping that after all the hurt, something better must be next. We misunderstand randomness because true randomness looks strange to human eyes. We expect neat alternations, red, black, red, black. In reality, randomness clusters, wanders, repeats. It creates long streaks and sudden droughts without pattern or pity. And yet, when faced with a string of losses, we imagine the universe tilting toward justice. But chance does not owe us a win. In 1913, a famous disaster unfolded at a casino in Monte Carlo. The ball landed black 26 times in a row. Players lost millions betting on red, convinced that every black made a red more inevitable. Each new black only deepened their certainty and their losses. The universe is not a scales of justice machine. It is an ocean shifting without notice, without plan. The dice do not know you are losing. The wheel does not pity you. Maybe the cruelest trick of the gambler's fallacy isn't losing money. Maybe it's convincing you that life is fairer than it really is. And if believing that losses must reverse leads to disaster, what happens when a gambler knows they should walk away, but still believes they can time the perfect exit? In the next trap, we meet the voice that whispers, "Just one more hand." Gambler's conceit. You sit at the card table, your stack of chips smaller than it was an hour ago, but still enough to chase the memory of early wins. You tell yourself you'll leave soon after one more hand, one more spin, one more turn of luck. You're still in control. You can stop whenever you want, or that is what you believe. This is the gambler's conceit, the dangerous illusion that you will quit while you're ahead, that you'll recognize the perfect moment to walk away. But once you're caught in the rush of risk and reward, the exit always seems just a little farther ahead, just one more hand away. It's not about greed or even hope. It's about the mind's deep need to believe in its own control. We imagine ourselves as rational players, able to override emotion, able to outsmart the trap we're already tangled inside. Real-life examples unfold daily in casinos, trading floors, even personal decisions. A gambler wins early and vows to leave once their winnings double, only to find themselves riding another wave of bets, losses piling up, the just one more promise dissolving into air. A stock investor tells herself she'll sell when she makes back her losses and watches as the price falls further, paralyzed by the belief that control is just one more decision away. In the grip of the gambler's conceit, the future always holds a better ending, just a few steps further. The mind rewrites the plan with every hand played, moving the goalpost again and again. Psychologists have found that once people are engaged in risky behavior, the probability of stopping declines sharply. Every decision becomes entangled with emotion, pride, frustration, fear of regret. And the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to imagine walking away with less than what you first dreamed. You don't stop because you're winning. You don't stop because you're losing. You don't stop because the mind has made stopping conditional on a fantasy that recedes faster the closer you think you are. Maybe the real danger isn't losing everything. Maybe it's losing the clarity to know when to stop. And if we can convince ourselves that the next hand will be the last, then what happens when we start seeing patterns in pure randomness, patterns that whisper that meaning is hiding where none exists? Because in the next trap, the mind finds shapes in noise and sees designs where there is only coincidence. Clustering illusion. A neighborhood reels after a string of illnesses. 5 cases, all within a few blocks. Whispers spread. Something must be wrong. The water, the air, the soil. It can't be coincidence. Patterns like this don't just happen, but sometimes they do. This is the clustering illusion, the tendency to see meaningful patterns in random data. The mind, trained by evolution to detect structure, struggles to accept that randomness clusters naturally, without cause, without intention. In randomness, streaks happen. Events bunch together, just as a tossed handful of seeds won't land perfectly evenly across a field. Life does not distribute events neatly. Randomness has clumps, gaps, bursts of intensity followed by long silences. But when we encounter these clumps, we instinctively reach for explanations, and often we invent them. In the early 2000s, reports of cancer clusters near power lines and cell phone towers ignited fear across communities. Investigations followed, but most found no credible link. The clusters, though terrifying, were consistent with the random distribution of disease across large populations. The pattern felt too sharp to be meaningless. But it was. The clustering illusion also haunts our understanding of luck. A series of lottery winners from the same town leads to conspiracy theories. A string of earthquakes in a region sparks rumors of ancient curses or hidden faults. In truth, random chance often creates clusters that feel significant but are statistically ordinary. Our brains hate randomness. We crave order, predictability, narrative. When we see scattered stars in the night sky, we draw constellations. When we notice 2 bad events happening close together, we assume a deeper connection. We can't help it. It's how our minds survived ancient dangers hidden in the noise. But the need for pattern can lead us astray. We chase ghosts. We fear phantoms. We waste energy fighting imagined threats while real ones slip past unnoticed. Maybe the world isn't plotting. Maybe it's just moving, chaotic, indifferent, and tangled in ways too vast for us to map. And if we can mistake ordinary randomness for grand design, then what happens when we start drawing sweeping conclusions from tiny samples, believing that a handful of experiences reveals the shape of the whole world? Because in the next trap, the mind's hunger for certainty leads it to trust too much and too little, and mistakes fragments for truths. Law of small numbers. You hear about a tiny town where 2 lottery winners came from the same neighborhood. You hear about a small hospital where 5 babies in a row were born prematurely. You shake your head in wonder. The odds must be astronomical. Something special must be happening there. Or maybe not. This is the law of small numbers, the mistaken belief that small samples should reflect the properties of large populations, that a handful of events should mirror the grand patterns of the world. But small numbers mislead. They swing wildly, exaggerate flukes, and paint chaos as meaning. In one famous study, participants were told about 2 hospitals. In one, many babies were born every day. In the other, very few. They were asked which hospital would be more likely to have days where more than 60% of babies were boys. Most guessed the larger hospital. But statistically, the smaller hospital was far more likely. Smaller samples are more volatile. They're prone to dramatic, unrepresentative swings. Yet the mind expects stability, even when it's the last thing randomness offers. The law of small numbers haunts everything from gambling to medicine to everyday intuition. A drug trial on a tiny group shows promising results, but later trials with larger groups reveal it was just noise. A few personal experiences lead someone to generalize about entire cities, cultures, professions, judging millions by the flicker of a few. We trust too much in early patterns. A student aces 2 tests and is labeled gifted for life. A business succeeds with its first product and assumes it has unlocked a formula for endless success. A new habit feels easy for a week, and we assume it will stay easy forever. The mind craves a neat world where small glimpses reveal deep truths, but reality often reserves its secrets for larger views, for slow, patient patterns invisible to quick glances and small encounters. Maybe wisdom begins by resisting the rush to judge. Maybe it lives in the humility of knowing that a small cluster of wins does not prove invincibility, and a handful of losses does not prove doom. And if we're so easily fooled into believing that tiny samples reveal great truths, then what happens when we start combining probabilities, stacking conditions on top of each other, and trusting our intuition to make sense of it all? Because in the next trap, the mind does something even stranger. It believes that a complicated story is somehow more likely than a simple truth. Conjunction fallacy. You meet Linda. She is outspoken, passionate about social justice, and majored in philosophy. When asked which is more likely, that Linda is a bank teller or that she is a bank teller who is active in the feminist movement, most people choose the second. It feels right. It fits the story your mind has already begun weaving. But statistically, it's wrong. This is the conjunction fallacy, the error of believing that 2 events together are more likely than 1 event alone. In reality, every additional detail shrinks probability. The more conditions you add to a story, the less likely it becomes. But the mind craves richness, not raw likelihood. It hungers for stories that feel complete. The famous Linda problem revealed just how powerful this bias can be. Participants consistently rated the conjunction, Linda being a bank teller and a feminist, as more probable than her being a bank teller alone. Why? Because the richer, more detailed story felt more representative of who Linda seemed to be. We mistake plausibility for probability. You see it everywhere. A weather forecast says there's a 20% chance of rain. Someone elaborates, it'll probably rain if the temperature drops and the storm moves east. The story feels more convincing, even though every added if makes the outcome less likely. We fall into the trap because the mind is a storyteller, not a calculator. It prizes coherence over caution. It rewards stories that make sense emotionally, even if the math behind them crumbles. In real life, this fallacy shapes our fears and our dreams. We imagine catastrophic chains of events, a job loss leading to homelessness leading to disaster, and feel certain it must happen because the narrative feels complete. We build hopeful chains, too, believing that finding the right mentor at the right time in the right city will inevitably launch a perfect career. But the truth is colder, simpler. Each link added to the chain weakens it. Each end in your story slices into the probability, even if your heart insists otherwise. Maybe wisdom means loving stories, but fearing them too. Because when you trust a rich narrative over simple odds, you risk building your life on a house of mist, beautiful, intricate, and easily undone. And if the mind can be so easily seduced by tangled stories, what happens when it tries to untangle uncertainty and fails to grasp how probabilities combine and split? In the next trap, we watch the mind falter in the opposite direction, underestimating the chance that at least one event might come true. Disjunction Fallacy. You glance at your calendar. You think about all the people who might call you today, an old friend, your boss, your sibling, a neighbor. You wonder, will anyone call? None of them seem very likely. It feels like you'll be waiting forever, but you're more likely to get a call than you think. This is the disjunction fallacy, a fancy way of saying we forget that having lots of chances makes something more likely to happen. Imagine you have 10 balloons. Only one balloon has a prize inside. If you get just one balloon, it's hard to win. But if you get 10 chances to pop a balloon, you're much more likely to find the prize. It's the same with your friends calling. Each one might not call by themselves, but with so many of them, there's a good chance someone will. Our brains like to think in simple ways. We tend to look at just one thing at a time. Will Sarah call? Instead of will anyone call? We forget that when you add up lots of little chances, they turn into a big chance. Our minds like stories that are neat and tidy, but life isn't always like that. Life is more like a field full of tiny wildflowers, each one small on its own, but together they cover the whole meadow. This mistake shows up all over real life. In hospitals, people think they're safe if each rare illness is unlikely, but they forget that with lots of tiny risks combined, the danger gets bigger. In business, people see lots of little problems and think none of them matter until all those small problems pile up into something serious. In everyday life, you might think missing 1 or 2 bills isn't a big deal until they snowball into overwhelming debt. The disjunction fallacy happens because real life is messy. It's not just one thing or the other. It's lots of little things, all happening at once. Weaving together, we see the world through a small keyhole and think we understand the whole room. When we ignore how all the small chances add up, we get surprised, sometimes in ways that really matter. A quiet buildup of risks or opportunities turns into a flood when we least expect it. Maybe real wisdom isn't about seeing the biggest threat. Maybe it's about noticing all the small ones quietly adding up, like tiny drops filling a hidden well. And if we already have trouble thinking about lots of small chances, what happens when we look at events happening one after another, and our mind rushes to say, this must have caused that? Because in the next trap, we find ourselves tricked by one of the oldest mistakes of all, believing that just because something happened after something else, it must have happened because of it. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. You wake up with a sore throat. You drink a special tea someone recommended. Honey, ginger, lemon, a dash of something mysterious. The next morning, you feel better. You smile, convinced the tea cured you. Maybe it did, or maybe you were already getting better. This is the hidden danger that creeps into everyday thinking, not just the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, but something deeper, the mind's desperate need to link cause and effect, even when the links are shadows. Post hoc ergo propter hoc means after this, therefore because of this. It's the old mistake of believing that because one thing followed another, the first must have caused the second. But beneath the surface, it reveals something even more profound. We are wired to stitch the world into stories of influence and consequence, even when reality is murkier. In ancient times, people watched the sky darken and thunder roll after a ritual dance and believed they had summoned the rain. Early doctors drained blood from feverish patients and credited recovery to the treatment, never seeing how often they worsened it instead. Today, someone might take a new vitamin, notice their energy improve, and swear by it, even if other forces were at work. Our brains crave certainty. We hunger for a world where actions have clear results, where gestures change fate, where effort can be rewarded in predictable ways. Randomness is frightening. Powerlessness is worse, so we reach for the nearest explanation and plant it like a flag. It happens in small ways. The lucky socks before a big exam, the ritual cup of coffee before a successful meeting. And it happens in enormous ways, leaders blamed for economic downturns they never caused, or credited with victories built by forces beyond their reach. The need to impose causality is not foolish. It's how we survive. It's what makes humans extraordinary. The ability to imagine that our actions matter. But when this instinct hardens into certainty where none is justified, we lose sight of the tangled, chaotic nature of the world. Sometimes events simply follow one another without a secret cord linking them. Sometimes what seems like a cause is just a coincidence. Maybe the hardest truth is that many things heal, crumble, grow, or break on their own timeline, indifferent to the small actions we take around them. Maybe wisdom lies not in denying causality, but in respecting how elusive it can be. Because when we mistake sequence for consequence, we don't just fool ourselves. We risk building entire lives, policies, and beliefs on illusions. And if the mind so easily forges false chains of cause and effect, what happens when we misread the natural rise and fall of life itself, when we think improvements or declines must have a special cause, even when they're just natural swings? In the next trap, we find a subtler illusion, one where the mind clings to explanations for changes that were always destined to happen, with or without our stories. Regression Fallacy. A star athlete hits a stunning winning streak. The headlines explode. Unstoppable, legendary, but soon enough, their performance cools, slipping back toward average. The fans look for causes, an injury, a personal crisis, a change in training, anything to explain the fall. But sometimes, nothing changed at all. This is the quiet trap of regression fallacy, the tendency to seek dramatic explanations for what is, at heart, just the natural swing back toward the middle. In life, extremes often pull back toward the average. A company has a blowout year. The next year looks ordinary. A student aces a test unusually well, then returns to their usual performance. A city's crime rate spikes, then settles down again. In all these cases, the mind searches for stories, patterns, heroes, or villains. But often these ups and downs are simply the math of life, the gentle gravity that pulls extremes back toward center. The idea of regression to the mean was first named by Sir Francis Galton in the 19th century. He noticed that exceptionally tall parents tended to have children closer to average height. It wasn't that the children failed to inherit greatness. It was that the extreme outcomes, on either end, naturally slide back toward the typical over time. But the human mind doesn't like this. We hunger for reasons. We want each rise and fall to mean something. If sales dip after a record month, we blame bad leadership. If a health scare passes without treatment, we credit a new diet or a lucky charm. If an artist releases a mediocre album after a masterpiece, we wonder what went wrong. It's not that real causes never exist. Sometimes they do. But the regression fallacy teaches us a hard truth. Not every change needs an explanation. Sometimes luck clusters. Sometimes randomness runs hot or cold. And when the pendulum swings back, it's not because fate changed its mind. It's because it always does. The danger of regression fallacy is more than just embarrassment. It warps how we invest energy and blame. Companies overhaul strategies based on normal fluctuations. Politicians take credit for improvements that would have happened anyway. Schools implement new programs after random bad years, mistaking randomness for a crisis. We intervene where no intervention was needed, and sometimes make things worse. Maybe maturity means accepting that not every movement in life is a message. Maybe it's learning to sit with the uncomfortable fact that sometimes things get better or worse all by themselves. And if we are so quick to explain away normal fluctuations, what happens when we miss the rare, enormous events, the ones so far outside our expectations that they shatter everything we thought we knew? Because in the next trap, the mind doesn't just misread the normal, it blinds itself to the extraordinary. Black Swan Blindness. On a quiet September morning in 2001, the world changed in an instant. 2 planes struck the towers, and everything after shifted. Markets collapsed. Governments restructured. Wars began. In hindsight, analysts scrambled to point to warnings, intelligence failures, overlooked reports, small signs. But before that day, few imagined such an event was possible. It was a black swan, not a bird, but a metaphor. A term made famous by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. It describes rare, unpredictable events that have massive consequences, events that lie far outside the realm of regular expectation. The term comes from an old belief. For centuries, Europeans assumed all swans were white because every swan they had ever seen was. Then explorers in Australia found black swans, and the idea was shattered. Black swans expose a fundamental flaw in human thinking. We don't just fail to predict rare events, we fail to imagine them. Black swan blindness is this inability to see beyond the familiar, to believe the world will keep behaving as it has. We build financial models, social structures, safety nets, all based on what has happened before, then something breaks through. A market crash, a pandemic, a war, a disruptive technology, an extinction-level event. And suddenly, all our predictions collapse. The fallacy is not just in being surprised, it's in believing that because something hasn't happened yet, it won't. It's why people scoff at warnings until disaster arrives. It's why disaster preparedness always feels overcautious. Until the power grid fails, the levees break, the virus spreads. We anchor our expectations to what is known, what is seen, what is repeated. But black swans live in the long tail of probability, the extreme edge where events are so rare that they seem impossible until they are not. Before 2008, the housing market felt unshakable. Before COVID-19, global lockdowns felt like science fiction. Before the internet, letters and landlines felt permanent. Black swan blindness isn't a lack of intelligence, it's a limit of imagination. The tragedy is that most black swans look obvious in hindsight. We line up the clues, we point to the missed signs, we punish those who failed to see. But almost no one does in time, not because they didn't look, but because they looked only through the lens of the past. Maybe the lesson isn't to try to predict black swans. Maybe it's to build lives, systems, and expectations that assume the unimaginable will eventually arrive. Because the real danger isn't that rare events happen. It's that we build our futures assuming they won't. And if we can be so blind to the unseen risks, what happens when we draw our lessons only from the visible successes? When we forget the failures that didn't leave behind stories because they never made it through. Because in the next trap, the mind celebrates the winners and forgets all the invisible dead ends behind them. Survivorship Bias. You read a story about a startup founder who dropped out of college, worked out of a garage, and became a billionaire. The lesson seems clear. Follow your passion, ignore the rules, and success will come. But what about the hundreds, maybe thousands, who followed that same path and vanished quietly? That's survivorship bias, the tendency to focus on the winners who made it through while ignoring the many who didn't. It tricks us into seeing a path as successful, not because it truly is, but because only the survivors get to tell the tale. During World War II, engineers studying damaged aircraft noticed bullet holes clustered in the wings and tail. The obvious solution: reinforce those areas. But statistician Abraham Wald pointed out a deeper truth. The planes being studied were the ones that made it back. The holes showed where damage could be survived. The areas without bullet holes, the engines and cockpit, were where hits led to destruction. That's what needed reinforcement. We often miss the lessons of those who didn't return. Survivorship bias appears in every corner of life. We see successful authors who wrote their first book on a typewriter and think that must be the key, forgetting the millions of equally talented writers whose work was never read. We idolize Olympic athletes and think it was hard work and vision alone, forgetting the role of timing, opportunity, and sheer biological lottery. In business, people look at thriving companies and assume their strategies are brilliant. But for every unicorn startup, there are 100 with the same idea that failed in silence. In investing, we read about people who beat the market and think it's a repeatable skill, overlooking the sea of portfolios that never reached the surface. We listen to advice from people who made it, believing their methods created their outcome. But success selects for visibility. It tells only one side of the story. We don't hear from the businesses that tried the same things and folded. We don't hear from the athletes who trained just as hard but got injured before their peak. We don't hear from the artists who poured their lives into their craft but never found an audience. Success writes the history books. Failure disappears from the page. And yet, it's in those vanished stories that the real lessons often live. What didn't work? What went wrong? What luck couldn't overcome? What effort alone couldn't fix? Maybe wisdom lies not in copying those who won. Maybe it lies in listening for the quiet voices of those who didn't. Because if we only study the visible winners, we build a distorted map of the world, one that leads us down roads paved by chance, not truth. And if we can be misled by the absence of failure, what happens when we ignore the background data entirely? When we focus so tightly on the story in front of us that we forget to ask how common or rare that story really is? Because in the next trap, the mind doesn't just forget the losers, it forgets the base rates. Base rate neglect. A woman receives a positive result on a rare disease test. The test is 95% accurate. She's terrified. She tells herself there's a 95% chance she has it. The doctor sighs. In truth, the actual chance might be closer to 10%. Why? Because she forgot to ask a more important question. How rare is the disease to begin with? This is base rate neglect, a mental blind spot where we ignore general statistical facts, the base rates in favor of the specific case right in front of us. When we hear a vivid result or story, our brains grab hold of it tightly and throw away the quiet backdrop that gives it context. Imagine a disease that affects just 1 in 1,000 people. A test that's 95% accurate still means that in a group of 1,000 healthy people, about 50 might receive false positives. If only one person actually has the disease, then most positive results are wrong. But to the person receiving the result, the number 95% feels like a verdict. They forget the base rate, the rarity of the disease itself. This fallacy sneaks into everything from medicine to marketing to media. We hear about one student who drops out and becomes a millionaire, and forget that most who drop out never recover financially. We hear a news story about a crime committed by someone with a mental illness, and forget that the vast majority of people with mental illness are not violent at all. We see a flashy headline about a trend, a surge in some rare behavior, but never ask what the numbers looked like before. When the specific is dramatic, the general disappears. Base rate neglect makes us misjudge risks. We fear flying more than driving because plane crashes dominate the news, even though car accidents are vastly more common. We invest in startups based on exciting pitches, ignoring the overwhelming odds against new businesses succeeding. We believe in personality quizzes or profiling tools that seem eerily accurate, without realizing that they're built on generic descriptions that would feel true for almost anyone. The truth is, our minds aren't naturally built for statistics. We evolved to respond to the concrete, the visible, the urgent. Numbers in the background don't stir our emotions the way a single vivid case can, but that vividness can lead us into dangerous territory. Maybe wisdom means learning to pause, to step back, to ask not just, is this compelling, but also, how common is this really? Because the next time we hear that someone matches a description or fits a pattern or tested positive for something rare, we must remember the background noise. How many don't? How many fit by chance? How many outcomes, no matter how unlikely, are expected once in a while because the world is large? And if we already forget the base rates when judging ordinary events, what happens when someone's freedom is on the line, and we think that a small chance of guilt is enough to justify a conviction? Because in the next trap, we meet a fallacy that mistakes probability for proof. Prosecutor's fallacy. A drop of blood is found at a crime scene. DNA testing shows the odds of a random person matching that sample are 1 in 1 million. The prosecution turns to the jury and says, there are 6 million people in the city. The chance this DNA match belongs to someone other than the defendant is almost zero. It sounds convincing, but it's dangerously wrong. This is the prosecutor's fallacy. A confusion between two different probabilities. The probability of a match given innocence, and the probability of innocence given a match. They are not the same, but in the courtroom, where statistics meet emotion, they often blur. A DNA match might be rare, but if millions of people could have left it, then dozens might match by chance, without knowing how many people could have been at the scene, or whether the person had any reason to be there, or what other evidence exists. The match is just a piece of noise in a much larger puzzle. The prosecutor's fallacy swaps conditional probabilities, and in doing so, creates a false sense of certainty. It says the evidence is rare, so the suspect must be guilty, but that's not how probability works. Imagine a man is accused of stealing a car, and a partial fingerprint from the crime scene matches his. The prosecutor tells the jury that the odds of a random person matching the print are just 1 in 1,000. That sounds damning, but they forget to mention something important. The fingerprint database contains hundreds of thousands of people. Statistically, dozens might match by chance. If the match is the only evidence, the probability that the suspect is innocent might still be high. But when juries hear how rare the match is, they often confuse it with certainty of guilt. They don't ask the deeper question, how often would this kind of evidence point to the wrong person? And that's the danger, the illusion of precision standing in for proof. This fallacy has had real consequences. In the UK, a woman was convicted of murder after both her babies died from sudden infant death syndrome. An expert claimed the odds of this happening naturally were 1 in 73 million. But he ignored other key factors: genetics, family history, and most importantly, the number of families in which this rare tragedy might occur. Her conviction was overturned, but only after years of public outcry. In courtrooms, the stakes are life and liberty. And yet probability is often misused, misunderstood, or weaponized. Juries are told that rare means impossible, that statistical coincidence is proof. But probability is subtle. Context matters. And when we treat numbers as magic tricks, we can send innocent people to prison. The prosecutor's fallacy is not just a legal error, it's a warning about how our minds crave narrative clarity. We want numbers to settle arguments, but numbers without understanding are just illusions dressed in confidence. Maybe real justice means knowing when not to trust a number on its own, Maybe it means remembering that even strong evidence is not the whole story. Because when we confuse the probability of evidence under innocence with the probability of innocence itself, we don't just get the math wrong, we risk getting everything wrong. And if we can be misled by the misuse of a statistic, what happens when our attention is pulled not by truth or logic, but by whatever stands out the most? Because in the next trap, we explore how the mind is drawn not to what matters, but to what breaks the pattern. Von Restorff Effect. You're handed a list of words to memorize: apple, chair, lamp, bottle, volcano, spoon, rug, book. Hours later, when you're asked to recall the list, one word jumps out instantly: volcano. You don't remember it because it came first, or because it came last. You remember it because it didn't fit. This is the von Restorff effect, also known as the isolation effect, the brain's tendency to remember things that stand out from their surroundings. It was first described in 1933 by German psychiatrist Hedwig von Restorff, who found that when people are shown a list of similar items, the one that breaks the pattern is far more likely to be remembered. In a sea of sameness, difference is magnetic. This effect is neither good nor bad on its own. It helps us survive. We notice the red snake in a green jungle. We remember the loud voice in a quiet room. The brain is built to detect contrast, but that same reflex can lead us astray. We mistake what's memorable for what's meaningful. In politics, a candidate who dresses unusually or makes provocative statements becomes unforgettable, even if their ideas are no more substantial than the rest. In advertising, the weird, jarring commercial sticks with us, even if we forget what it was selling. In meetings, the loudest or strangest comment echoes long after the thoughtful ones fade. The von Restorff effect is why one typo ruins a paragraph, why the one moment of awkwardness can stain a conversation, why the child who acts out gets all the attention while the others are overlooked. What stands out shapes our memory, and memory shapes our judgment. But there's a deeper danger here. What stands out doesn't always deserve our focus. We remember the plane crash, not the millions of safe flights. The one tragic story on the news, not the broad data showing steady progress. We remember the one student who challenged us rudely, not the dozens who quietly learned. We remember the worst review, the weirdest moment, the sharpest pain. Our perception of reality becomes warped by salience. Maybe wisdom means learning to pause when something grabs our attention, to ask, does this matter, or is it just loud? Because memory is not a fair recorder. It highlights what shimmered, screamed, or shocked. It filters out the steady, the repeated, the boring, even when that's where truth lives. And if our minds are shaped by the things that break the pattern, what happens when those things distract us from the bigger picture entirely? Because in the next trap, we'll explore how the mind zooms in on one shiny piece of information and lets it define everything else. Focusing effect. A journalist asks two people from opposite coasts, what makes people in California happier than people in the Midwest? Both give thoughtful answers: sunshine, beaches, culture. But what if the premise is flawed? What if Californians aren't happier at all? This is the focusing effect, the tendency to place too much importance on one aspect of an experience while ignoring the full context. When we try to predict happiness, success, risk, or value, our minds instinctively zoom in on one vivid detail and let it dominate the whole picture. We imagine that moving to a nicer city, getting a new job, or buying a bigger house will transform our lives. And yet, research consistently shows that people adapt quickly to changes, good and bad. The sunny weather becomes background noise. The corner office loses its thrill. The big kitchen stops feeling big. But in the moment of decision, that one detail feels huge. It eclipses everything else. In one famous study, psychologist Daniel Kahneman asked people to compare the happiness of Californians and Midwesterners. Most assumed Californians were happier because they focused on the weather. but in reality, both groups reported similar life satisfaction. Why? Because in daily life, weather plays a tiny role compared to relationships, work, health, and meaning. But when we imagine a life we're not living, we latch onto the standout features and overlook everything else. The focusing effect doesn't just distort personal expectations. It warps public opinion, policy, and spending. Voters might obsess over a single issue, taxes, crime, immigration, as if it explains everything. Leaders might chase the most visible problem, neglecting quieter ones with deeper roots. And marketers know how to use this. They don't sell the product. They sell the lifestyle, the transformation, the one powerful feature that will change everything. A luxury watch is more than timekeeping. A new phone is more than a tool. We focus on the glow of change, not the quiet reality that follows. The mind loves simplicity. One story, one cause, one solution. But life rarely works that way. The things we focus on expand. The things we ignore vanish. Maybe wisdom begins with asking, what am I not seeing? What else matters that doesn't sparkle? What part of the picture hides in shadow because I never thought to look? Because the next time you're offered a choice or told a story, it might not be what's true that sways you. It might just be how the truth is framed. Framing effect. Two doctors describe a surgery. The first says, this operation has a 90% survival rate. The second says, this operation has a 10% chance of death. They are saying the same thing, but most people feel comforted by the first and unsettled by the second. That one word, survival or death, shifts the emotional weight of the choice. This is the framing effect, the way our decisions and judgments are shaped not just by facts, but by how those facts are presented. The numbers don't change, but the way we feel about them does. The framing effect lives at the intersection of emotion and logic. It shows us how vulnerable the mind is to suggestion, even when we're dealing with the exact same information. In one study, participants were asked to choose between two treatments for a disease. One was framed as saving 200 lives. The other was framed as letting 400 people die. Most chose the first, even though both led to the same outcome. Gain felt safer than loss. Words shaped risk. It affects what we eat, how we vote, where we invest, who we trust. A food label that says 90% fat-free sounds healthier than one that says 10% fat. A policy framed as helping the poor is received differently than one framed as raising taxes. In business, this is marketing. In politics, it's messaging. In daily life, it's the subtle art of persuasion. We are constantly being framed, and we do it to ourselves. When we fail at something, we might say we learned a lesson instead of admitting defeat. We soften the edges of failure or sharpen the edge of blame, depending on the story we want to believe. The danger isn't just that we get manipulated. The danger is that we forget we're being told a version of reality, not the whole of it, because we don't make decisions in a vacuum. We make them in rooms full of words, emotions, and carefully chosen angles. Even memory is shaped by framing. Ask someone what they saw during a car accident, and they'll describe it differently depending on the word you use. If you say the car's smashed, they'll recall broken glass. If you say they bumped, they won't. The brain fills in what the frame suggests. Maybe wisdom means learning to ask, what would this look like if you said it another way? Because every truth comes wrapped in language, and language carries weight, tone, and direction. What looks like certainty may just be confidence in costume. And if our judgment can shift depending on a single word, what happens when we anchor our decisions to a number, a guess, or a first impression, and never move far from it? Because in the next trap, we don't just follow the frame. We stick to the first number we see. Anchoring bias. You walk into a store and see a winter coat with a price tag $600. It's too much, so you move on. But then, on another rack, you find a similar coat marked down to $300. Suddenly it feels like a bargain. You're tempted. You buy it. What just happened? That first number, $600, was never meant to be fair. It was an anchor, a number planted in your mind to shape how you judged everything that came after. This is anchoring bias, the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information offered, the anchor, when making decisions. Once an anchor is set, even if it's arbitrary, our minds cling to it and adjust from there rather than starting fresh. It doesn't just happen in stores. It happens everywhere. In one famous study, people spun a wheel rig to land on either 10 or 65. Then they were asked, what percentage of African countries are in the United Nations? Those who saw the number 65 guessed much higher than those who saw 10. The number had nothing to do with the question. It just planted itself in their minds and quietly pulled their answers toward it. Anchoring works in salary negotiations. The first number mentioned often sets the range. It works in courtrooms where damage awards are swayed by the first figure introduced. It works in real estate where a seller's initial asking price becomes the mental reference point, no matter the home's true value. Even when we know the anchor is wrong, it still sticks. That's what makes it so powerful and so deceptive. Anchoring doesn't just distort decisions, it distorts perception. A meal that costs $40 may seem expensive unless you just saw a $100 steak on the menu. A risk that feels high in isolation might feel small compared to a scarier one. We don't evaluate things in isolation. We evaluate them in relation to what came first. And once that anchor is dropped, it takes real effort to pull it up. Why does the brain do this? Because anchoring saves time. It gives us a starting point in a complex world. But the shortcut comes at a cost. It locks our thinking to a reference that may be irrelevant or intentionally manipulative. Maybe wisdom begins with asking, what was my first impression based on, and what would I think if I started from scratch? Because every decision has a weight tied to it, and sometimes that weight was placed there by someone else. And if our judgments are skewed by what comes first, what happens when our thoughts are driven by what comes fastest, what comes loudest, what comes most easily to mind? Because in the next trap, the mind doesn't search for what's true. It settles for what's available. Availability heuristic. You watch the evening news. The first story is about a plane crash. The footage is dramatic. Twisted metal, sirens, voices choked with panic. Later, someone asks if you'd rather fly or drive to your next destination. You choose to drive. This is the availability heuristic, the mental shortcut that leads us to judge the likelihood of events based on how easily we can recall examples of them. The more vivid, emotional, or recent something is, the more real and frequent it feels, even if it's incredibly rare. Statistically, flying is much safer than driving, but plane crashes are louder. They make headlines. They stir emotion. They stick. The mind doesn't tally data. It tells stories. In a now classic experiment, people were asked whether more words in the English language start with the letter K or have K as the third letter. Most chose the first because it's easier to think of words that start with K. But in truth, there are more with K in the third position. It just takes more mental effort to find them. The same effect distorts our sense of danger. People fear shark attacks more than drowning. They worry about terrorism more than heart disease. They install home security systems but forget to wear seatbelts. The mind doesn't care about the numbers. It cares about the stories that light up our imagination. Media amplifies this. One act of violence, one scandal, one viral post, and suddenly the rare feels routine. A single headline can outweigh 100 quiet facts, and soon we believe the world is more dangerous, more broken, more extreme than it really is. The heuristic isn't irrational. In our evolutionary past, it kept us alive. If you saw lightning strike a tree, you learned to avoid tall trees during storms. If someone in your tribe was attacked by a predator, your mind didn't wait for statistics. It remembered. But in the modern world, this shortcut can trap us. It fills our minds with noise. It rewards drama over truth, spectacle over substance, and it silently rewrites our perception of reality. We make decisions based on what floats to the top of memory, not what lies beneath the surface. The loudest facts drown out the truest ones. What we hear most isn't always what happens most. And if the stories that come easily to mind can bend our judgment, what happens when we start to believe that the patterns we see on the surface must reflect something deeper, something essential? Because in the next trap, the mind stops asking how likely something is and starts asking how much it looks like it belongs. Representativeness Heuristic. You meet Tom at a party. He wears thick glasses, carries a worn paperback copy of a science fiction novel, and starts quoting philosophical arguments 5 minutes into your conversation. Someone asks what Tom does for a living. Without hesitation, you guess he's a librarian. But what if, statistically, the odds are far higher that he works in sales? This is the representativeness heuristic, a mental shortcut where we judge the probability of something based on how much it resembles what we already expect. When something fits a familiar pattern, we assume it must belong. We confuse similarity with likelihood. It feels intuitive. We see a quiet kid who loves puzzles and assume he'll become a mathematician, not a truck driver, even though there are far more truck drivers in the world. We hear that someone is assertive, strategic, and competitive, and assume she works in finance, ignoring that those traits exist in every field. We're not asking how likely something is. We're asking how well it fits the story we already know. Representativeness is cited in the similar effect of the gambler's fallacy, the regression fallacy, and the conjunction fallacy. We have already covered a famous study, Linda problem, in conjunction fallacy. Participants were told about Linda, a bright woman deeply concerned with social justice. They were asked which was more probable, that Linda is a bank teller or that Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. Most people chose the second, even though it's mathematically less likely. Adding more details makes a story feel richer, more vivid, more representative, but also less probable. The representativeness heuristic isn't just a statistical mistake, it's a mirror into how we stereotype. We meet someone, see their clothes, hear their accent, observe a habit, and draw conclusions. We assign roles, we match people to categories, we assume intent. We fill in blanks based on fragments. Sometimes that helps. We survive because we generalize. We recognize patterns. But those same reflexes can blind us. They lead us to ignore base rates, overlook outliers, and dismiss anyone who doesn't match the mold. It creeps into hiring decisions, into criminal profiling, into political debates, into daily conversation. It convinces us we understand people because they remind us of someone else. But the world is not built from perfect types. It's full of messy exceptions. We don't see what's there. We see what fits. And that can be dangerous. Because once we lock someone into a story, we stop asking questions. We stop checking probabilities. We stop seeing them clearly. And if our judgment can be shaped so easily by resemblance, what happens when we don't just see patterns, we feel them? What happens when our decisions are pulled, not by logic, but by the raw force of emotion? Because in the next trap, the mind doesn't ask what something is. It asks how it makes us feel. Effect heuristic. You're told about a new energy source. It's clean, efficient, and revolutionary. You feel excited, so you assume it must also be safe. Then you hear it's nuclear. Your stomach tenses. Suddenly, you picture meltdowns, radiation, disaster, and just like that, your judgment flips. This is the effect heuristic, a mental shortcut where we make decisions based on how something makes us feel, not on what we actually know about it. Our emotions become stand-ins for logic. If it feels good, it must be good. If it feels bad, it must be risky. In one study, participants were asked to evaluate various technologies. When they had a positive emotional response to something, they rated both its benefits as high and its risks as low. When their feelings were negative, the opposite happened. Risks skyrocketed, benefits vanished. This happened even when people knew nothing about the actual technology. Emotion overrode thought. The effect heuristic doesn't just shape how we judge new things, it shapes how we remember, predict, and act. We avoid cities we feel unsafe in, even if statistics say they're low crime. We fear air travel because we feel anxious on planes, even though driving is far more dangerous. We assume someone is trustworthy because we like them, and untrustworthy because we don't. It affects voting, medicine, relationships, and risk-taking. A smiling face on a product makes us believe it's better. A news story with vivid details makes the threat feel more real. Politicians speak in emotional tones to sway decisions, knowing facts won't matter if the mood is right. And the mind doesn't always realize it's doing this. Emotion colors everything subtly, quickly, and silently. We think we're being rational, but beneath the surface we're constantly asking, how does this make me feel? The power of the effect heuristic lies in how fast it works. Emotion leaps ahead of reason. It fills in gaps, builds instant reactions, and sends us charging toward or away from something before we have time to ask why. It isn't wrong to feel. Emotion is part of survival, but when feeling becomes the only compass, we can be pulled far from what is true, useful, or fair. We might avoid life-saving medicine because we don't like how it sounds, or support harmful policies because they make us feel safe. We might fear the wrong things, trust the wrong people, choose paths that feel right and go terribly wrong. When emotion leads, reason follows, but often too late. And if we can be moved so easily by how something feels in the moment, what happens when we lean toward what simply feels familiar? What if comfort becomes the guide, even when it's misleading? Because in the next trap, the mind doesn't just favor emotion, it favors what it already knows. Familiarity heuristic. You're walking through a foreign city at night. Everything is new. The signs, the smells, the rhythm of the street. But then you see a familiar logo, a fast food chain from home. You weren't hungry before. Now you step inside without thinking. That tug toward the known, that quiet pull of comfort, that's the familiarity heuristic at work. This cognitive shortcut leads us to prefer things we recognize. Familiar ideas feel safer. Familiar people seem more trustworthy. Familiar routines seem more effective. We don't question them, not because they're better, but because they're known. The brain evolved to treat the familiar as less threatening. In early human life, what was familiar had proven to be non-lethal. That berry didn't poison us last time. That trail didn't lead to predators. That tribe didn't attack. Repeating the familiar kept us alive. But in the modern world, that survival instinct can lead to bias. In marketing, brands leverage the familiarity heuristic constantly. The more times you see a product, even passively, the more likely you are to trust it. That's why companies flood your feed, your street, your grocery aisle. Not to convince you, but to prime your preference. Politics uses it too. A candidate whose name you've heard over and over feels more competent, more credible, even if you know nothing about their policies. A slogan repeated often enough begins to sound like common sense. And in relationships, we gravitate toward people who feel familiar, who speak like us, dress like us, believe like us. We confuse familiarity with compatibility, and sometimes stay too long in places or with people that feel safe, even when they aren't good for us. This heuristic also shapes fear. We worry less about familiar dangers, even if they're serious. We fear unfamiliar ones more, even when they're rare. A disease we've heard of before feels manageable. A new virus feels apocalyptic. A known street feels safer than an unfamiliar one, regardless of the actual crime rate. The familiarity heuristic doesn't ask, "Is this true?" It asks, "Have I seen this before?" And in a world that bombards us with repetition, that distinction matters. Because what you see often enough becomes what you believe, not through logic, but through quiet repetition. We remember what repeats. We trust what we recall. And if we place trust in what is familiar, what happens when risk is introduced, not through facts, but through the way it is presented? When fear or confidence is created by the shape of the frame itself, not the size of the danger. Framing risk. You're offered two investments. One is described as having a 5% chance of failure. The other is said to succeed 95% of the time. Most people pick the second, but they're the same. So why does one feel safer? This isn't just the framing effect we have covered earlier, where a decision changes based on how the information is presented. This is framing risk, a specific twist that manipulates our sense of danger rather than our preference. Framing effect influences what we choose. Framing risk influences what we fear. Risk isn't judged by math alone, it's judged by how the threat is introduced. Tell someone a new vaccine has a 1 in 100,000 chance of a severe side effect, and anxiety spikes. Reframe it as 99.999% of people experience no problems, and tension melts. The numbers never change. The emotional weight does. In public health, this framing can alter behavior. Telling people that 1 in 5 will get the flu generates concern. But say 80% won't get it, and motivation drops. The difference isn't comprehension, it's emotional response to risk. In media, it shapes headlines. A story about a 1 in 500 risk of flooding might not alarm readers, but reframe it as 500 homes under threat, and panic sets in. In insurance, you're sold policies by highlighting what you might lose, not what you might preserve. Fear moves faster than logic. This isn't just about fear, though. Framing risk also distorts courage. A manager may take a reckless gamble when told there's an 80% chance of success, but back away from the same project if told there's a 1 in 5 chance of failure. It also manipulates control. People are more afraid of things they can't see or influence. A disease with a 2% death rate feels worse if it's framed as random and unpredictable than if it's described as more severe in people with certain health conditions. The real world is full of uncertainty, but risk, when framed with fear, distorts how we act. We might over-prepare for unlikely threats or ignore real ones that are framed too gently. And because we rely so heavily on emotion to gauge risk, we become easy to persuade. We don't ask how likely something is. We ask how it feels. If it feels dangerous, it must be. But feelings are shaped, and the shape comes from framing. So, the next time you're weighing a risk, it's worth asking, is this fear accurate, or is it carefully placed there by the words I just heard? Because when fear is crafted by language, our reaction isn't to the risk itself, it's to the story that was told about it. And if we can be so easily nudged by how danger is described, what happens when the pain of losing something becomes stronger than any potential gain? Because in the next trap, we don't just feel risk, we run from loss, even when holding steady would help us more. Loss aversion. You're offered a gamble. Flip a coin. Heads, you win $100. Tails, you lose $100. Most people say no. Now change the offer. Heads, you win $150. Tails, you lose $100. Still, many refuse. This is loss aversion, the psychological principle that losing something hurts more than gaining the same thing feels good. The pain of a $100 loss weighs heavier than the joy of a $100 win. In fact, studies show we need a potential gain of about twice the size of a loss before we're willing to take the risk. This isn't just a quirk, it's a cornerstone of how we think. Our minds are wired to avoid pain more than they are to seek pleasure. From an evolutionary standpoint, it made sense. Early humans who avoided losses, like injury, social rejection, or poisoned food, were more likely to survive than those who took every gamble in search of reward. But in the modern world, that instinct doesn't always serve us. Loss aversion shows up in our decisions every day. We refuse to sell a failing stock because it means locking in a loss. We hold on to old clothes, unused gym memberships, or outdated subscriptions, not because we want them, but because we already paid for them. We fear quitting jobs, ending relationships, or letting go of ideas, even when we know they no longer serve us. Because letting go feels like losing. This mental bias affects public policy, investing, education, and personal health. A tax increase feels worse than an equivalent tax cut feels good. A failed diet feels more discouraging than a successful day feels rewarding. We hesitate to change, even when change would bring growth, because the first step often requires giving something up. Loss aversion doesn't just shape action, it shapes memory. We remember our losses longer, more vividly, and more emotionally than our wins. We revisit them. We ruminate. We try to fix them, undo them, make them mean something. And in doing so, we often throw more resources after what's already gone. That reflex, to avoid the pain of admitting a loss, is the setup for the next trap. Because sometimes we don't just fear losing. We keep investing in something we know is broken, simply because we already gave it so much. And in that next trap, reason doesn't guide us. The past does. Sunk cost fallacy. You sit in a theater halfway through a bad movie. It's boring, predictable, and every second crawls. But you stay. You already paid for the ticket. This is the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue an endeavor once we've invested time, money, or effort, even when it no longer benefits us. The rational choice would be to cut our losses, but the past exerts a grip. We think, I've come this far, I might as well finish. But the past is gone, and staying doesn't get it back. This fallacy isn't about logic, it's about emotion, specifically, the emotional cost of admitting that our investment was wasted. Quitting feels like failure. Walking away feels like losing. But the real loss comes when we keep going just to justify what we've already spent. It shows up in failing businesses. A company pours more money into a dying product because they've already spent so much developing it. Managers continue flawed projects to avoid admitting a mistake. Investors throw good money after bad, refusing to sell because the loss isn't real until they do. It happens in relationships. We stay in ones that make us unhappy because we've already given them years. We tell ourselves it would all be for nothing if we leave, but those years are spent. The question is whether the next one should be. It happens in education, careers, even hobbies. People stick with majors they hate, careers that drain them, or routines that no longer serve them, because they once did, because they can't bear the thought of wasted effort. It even shows up in everyday decisions, finishing books we're not enjoying, completing meals we no longer want, or watching the end of a TV series we lost interest in 5 episodes ago, just because we've already started. We convince ourselves that seeing something through gives it meaning, that persistence is virtue. But there's a difference between resilience and stubbornness, between commitment and entrapment. Effort spent in the wrong direction isn't redeemed by doubling down, it's deepened. Economists warn that sunk costs are irrelevant. The only thing that matters is future value. What will this choice bring now? Not what did it cost then. Yet the fallacy persists because we don't make decisions like accountants. We make them like storytellers, and abandoning a path midway feels like erasing the story. We want our investments to mean something. We want the ending to justify the beginning. But sometimes the best way to honor the past is to stop letting it define the future. To walk away is not to waste what came before. It's to learn from it. To make a new choice, not because the old one was a mistake, but because now you know more. And if the fear of loss keeps us stuck chasing sunk costs, what happens when we cling not just to our past investments, but to the familiar shape of the present? Because in the next trap, we don't hold on out of hope or fear. We hold on because change itself feels wrong. Status quo bias. You're given a simple choice. Keep your current health insurance plan or switch to one that's objectively better, lower costs, better coverage, more flexibility. Most people stay with what they have. This is status quo bias, the deeply rooted tendency to prefer things as they are, even when change would lead to better outcomes. It's not laziness, it's not ignorance. It's the mental comfort of familiarity, the safety of continuity, and the fear that any change, however promising, could carry invisible risks. At the heart of status quo bias is a powerful illusion that what exists now must be better, or at least safer, than the unknown. The bias isn't logical, it's emotional, and it colors every aspect of our lives. In retirement plans, workers are more likely to stay in default options, even if alternatives are more suited to their goals. In relationships, people settle into patterns that stopped working years ago because disrupting them feels scarier than enduring them. In technology, we hold on to old software, old tools, old habits, even when they're outdated, because learning something new feels overwhelming. And it's not just personal. In politics, we see status quo bias play out in voter behavior. People may dislike current policies or leaders, but hesitate to support change because the future is uncertain. In economics, markets resist innovation until the cost of maintaining the old becomes greater than the risk of the new. In social structures, outdated norms persist long after their usefulness, simply because that's how it's always been. Change creates tension. The current state, however flawed, carries the weight of familiarity, inertia, and psychological investment. It feels earned, protected, natural, and the mind will defend it. Status quo bias also interacts with other fallacies. It's strengthened by loss aversion. We fear losing the comfort of what we have more than we anticipate the benefits of something better. It's reinforced by sunk costs, because we've already invested so much into the current path. It's amplified by familiarity, because what's known feels safer. Even when we dislike the current state, it becomes a benchmark. We measure everything against it. Change becomes disruption. Alternatives feel like gambles, and so we stay. But staying isn't always safety. Sometimes it's stagnation. Sometimes it's decay. Sometimes the greatest risk is not making a change, but refusing to. The challenge isn't just in knowing change is better. It's in overcoming the instinct that says, better doesn't matter if it's unfamiliar. And if we cling to the status quo because we're afraid to lose what we have, what happens when we begin to overvalue our possessions simply because they are ours? Because in the next trap, the mind doesn't just prefer the familiar, it inflates the worth of anything it already owns. Endowment Effect. You're handed a coffee mug with your school's logo on it. It's free, part of a welcome package. Minutes later, someone offers to buy it from you. You pause. It's just a mug. You never wanted it before. But now that it's yours, you feel reluctant to part with it unless the offer is high. This is the endowment effect, our tendency to assign more value to things simply because we own them. Ownership transforms perception. The moment something becomes mine, it gains weight, not in utility, but in meaning. We don't just see its price, we feel its presence, and that presence alters how we evaluate it. In one famous experiment, researchers gave participants a mug and then asked how much they'd be willing to sell it for. Then they gave a different group the chance to buy the same mug. On average, sellers demanded twice as much as buyers were willing to pay. The object hadn't changed. Only the sense of ownership had. This effect appears across all walks of life. Homeowners often overvalue their properties, setting prices far above market rates, because to them, every wall, floor, and memory feels like an asset. Car owners overprice their used vehicles. Collectors inflate the worth of their possessions. Even children show the effect, refusing to trade identical toys after ownership has been established. Emotion clouds reason. We believe our attachment is a sign of value, but it's often just inertia, attachment, and identity projection. The thing becomes part of us. The endowment effect can shape negotiations, making compromise harder. It can distort markets, leading to overpricing and underbidding, and it can trap us into clinging to the unnecessary. Closets full of unused clothes, garages packed with forgotten tools, drawers cluttered with cables for devices we no longer own. And it doesn't stop at physical objects. We apply it to ideas too. Once we've taken ownership of a belief, we defend it harder. Once we've committed to a decision, we justify it more. Even if new evidence emerges, we resist letting go, not because the idea is right, but because it's ours. The endowment effect makes it harder to clean out, let go, and move on. It whispers, "This is part of you now." But just because we own something doesn't mean it's worth keeping. And just because we've held on to it doesn't mean we should keep carrying it. The trick isn't just knowing when to let go. It's seeing clearly enough to know what you're holding on because it's valuable, and what you're holding on because it's familiar. And if we overvalue what we already have, what happens when we try to estimate the time, effort, or complexity needed for something new? Because in the next trap, the mind doesn't just inflate value, it underestimates the cost of moving forward. Planning fallacy. You sit down with a clear mind and a fresh to-do list. You estimate you'll finish that work project in 2 days, paint the living room in 1 afternoon, finish writing your book in 6 months. Weeks later, the project is behind schedule. The paint cans are unopened, and your book file hasn't been touched since chapter 3. This is the planning fallacy, the tendency to underestimate how long a task will take, even when we've done similar tasks before. It's not just optimism, it's a deep, recurring error in how we imagine the future. First discovered by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, the planning fallacy shows how our minds focus on best-case scenarios, ignoring obstacles, distractions, and delays. We assume a smooth path even when we've stumbled before. We don't account for the email interruptions, the unexpected meetings, the moments of fatigue or loss of motivation. We think we're smarter, faster, more focused than last time. We build mental timelines that look perfect on paper and fall apart in reality. This fallacy costs more than time. It affects budgets, expectations, relationships, and trust. Governments plan infrastructure projects and miss deadlines by years. Tech companies announce release dates, only to push them back again and again. Students underestimate study time. Contractors underestimate construction. Couples underestimate the stress of moving. And the irony is, most of us already know we underestimate. We remember underestimating before, but in the moment, we feel this time will be different. The planning fallacy has a companion flaw. We focus on the task itself, not the context. We don't ask what happened the last 5 times I tried to do something like this. We ask, how long should this take if all goes well? It's an illusion of control, an idealization of time, but time doesn't listen to plans. It moves at its own pace. It adds things we didn't expect and removes the clarity we thought we'd have. That's why experts suggest an outside view. Instead of imagining how long this task will take, ask, how long did it take others? How long did similar projects take? What usually goes wrong? The goal isn't pessimism, it's realism. Because if you always expect the perfect version of the future, you'll always be late for it. And if our minds are so easily fooled by what we hope will happen, what happens when we start filtering the world not by time, but by belief? What happens when we only see the information that agrees with what we already think? Because in the next trap, the mind doesn't just plan wrong, it proves itself right, no matter what the truth is. Confirmation bias. You believe a certain diet works, so you search online for articles that prove it, scroll past any that criticize it, and nod along to testimonials that sound like your own experience. You're not just looking for information, you're looking for agreement. This is confirmation bias, the tendency to favor, seek out, and remember information that confirms what we already believe, while ignoring or dismissing anything that challenges it. It isn't about truth. It's about comfort. The mind wants to feel consistent. It wants to believe it's already right. And so it builds a hall of mirrors, reflecting back our own opinions, wrapped in articles, headlines, and conversations that echo what we already think. This bias doesn't just live online. It lives in science, religion, business, relationships. A CEO might ignore early signs. A strategy is failing because they were so confident it would succeed. A researcher may interpret ambiguous data in a way that supports their hypothesis. A person in love might overlook red flags because they've already decided this is the one. Confirmation bias can shape memory itself. We remember details that support our beliefs more vividly and forget or twist details that don't. We interpret neutral events in biased ways. A simple look from someone can seem like approval or insult, depending on what we already believe about them. It also changes how we ask questions. We frame them to get the answers we want. Don't you think this proves my point? Isn't it obvious that this method is better? We don't search for truth. We search for validation. In politics, this creates echo chambers. People follow only those who agree with them, read news that aligns with their side, and block dissenting views. Over time, beliefs harden, not because they're right, but because they're reinforced. Social media amplifies this. Algorithms feed us what we already click on. Every like, every share, every retweet is a reinforcement loop. We feel more certain, more righteous, more sure, while drifting further from complexity. And the danger isn't just personal. In medicine, business, law, and policy, confirmation bias can lead to bad diagnoses, failed strategies, wrongful convictions, and blind governance. We see what we expect and miss what matters. The antidote isn't easy. It requires discomfort, listening to people we disagree with, asking ourselves, what would I believe if I saw the opposite? Looking for the strongest argument against our position, not to destroy it, but to test its strength, because without that, belief becomes bubble. And inside a bubble, anything can seem true. And if the mind is this quick to defend its own beliefs, what happens when it starts to feel certain about knowledge, decisions, and predictions, far beyond what the facts support? Because in the next trap, the mind doesn't just filter what it believes. It overestimates how right it really is. Overconfidence effect. You're asked how confident you are in your answer to a trivia question. You say 90%. But you're only right 60% of the time. This is the overconfidence effect, our tendency to overestimate the accuracy of our knowledge, predictions, and abilities. We think we know more than we do, can do more than we can, and are right more often than reality suggests. It shows up everywhere. Doctors overestimate their diagnostic accuracy. Investors believe they can time the market. Drivers rate themselves as above average in skill. Entrepreneurs imagine their startup success is inevitable. Students are sure they aced the test, and then get a harsh surprise. The overconfidence effect is not just about arrogance, it's about how our brains build certainty on shaky ground. Part of the problem is that confidence feels good. Certainty is reassuring. Uncertainty feels like weakness, hesitation, danger. So we lean into boldness. We round up our guesses. We speak louder when we should pause. We assert when we should reflect. And the more we feel in control, the worse the effect gets. People are more overconfident in areas where feedback is slow, unclear, or emotionally charged. Predicting elections, forecasting markets, judging character, leading teams. The less immediate correction we get, the more inflated our sense of accuracy becomes. Overconfidence also rises with familiarity. The more often we've done something, the more certain we feel about our mastery, even if our actual results don't improve. That's why seasoned professionals can fall for it too. Ironically, the most confident people are often the least competent, a phenomenon related to the Dunning-Kruger effect. Those who lack skill often lack the awareness to know they're lacking, so they speak with unwarranted conviction. Meanwhile, experts, people who truly understand complexity, tend to hedge. They use words like likely, probably, it depends. Their awareness of how much they don't know keeps them honest. But in a world that rewards boldness, they're often overshadowed. This effect is costly. It leads to financial loss, failed ventures, strategic missteps, and broken trust. It fuels political extremism and conspiracy theories. It hardens groupthink and weakens collaboration. It makes us ignore good advice and walk into traps we could have avoided. Caution doesn't feel as heroic, but it's often more accurate. The solution isn't doubt. It's calibrated confidence. Confidence that adjusts with evidence, that knows when to speak and when to step back, that treats knowledge not as a trophy, but as a work in progress. Because certainty isn't the enemy. False certainty is. And if we already believe we're more accurate than we are, what happens when we assume everyone else agrees with us too? Because in the next trap, we don't just trust our own thoughts, we assume they belong to everyone around us. False consensus effect. You tell a joke at dinner, and no one laughs. You're surprised. You thought it was funny. You assumed everyone would. Later, you share an opinion online and get pushback. You feel confused, maybe even attacked. To you, the opinion seemed obvious. You figured most people would agree. That expectation, that assumption, that's the false consensus effect, the tendency to overestimate how much other people share our beliefs, preferences, and behaviors. In our minds, we're not just right, we're normal. And if others disagree, we think they're the exception, not us. This bias plays a quiet role in shaping perception. It makes our social circle feel like the world. It makes our habits feel typical, our politics feel mainstream. Our opinions feel common sense, and it does so because the brain craves certainty and social validation. We don't like to feel alone in our thinking, so we unconsciously project our values outward. We assume that most people, deep down, are like us. In one study, participants were asked whether they'd be willing to walk around campus wearing a sign that said "Eat at Joe's." Then they were asked how many others would agree to do it. People who agreed assumed others would too. Those who refused thought others would also say no. Regardless of the actual numbers, people believed their choice reflected the majority. The false consensus effect builds echo chambers. It filters our experience through people who think like us, act like us, talk like us. Our friends often reinforce our views. Our social media feeds mirror our beliefs. Our workplaces reward similar opinions. Slowly, we forget that these circles are not the world. And when we do encounter disagreement, it feels more extreme than it is, more surprising, more threatening, because it violates the illusion of consensus we quietly built around ourselves. The effect shapes public discourse. In politics, each side assumes they represent the real people. In culture, trends feel universal when they're actually niche. In businesses, teams make decisions assuming customers want what they would want. It leads to miscommunication, polarization, poor forecasting, and bad assumptions about what others need, believe, or value. The antidote isn't to assume you're always in the minority. It's to stay aware that your experiences are local, not global, that your preferences are real, but not representative. And when someone disagrees, it doesn't mean they're broken. It means the world is wider than the circle we've drawn. Because if we assume everyone thinks like us, what happens when things go wrong and we need to explain it to ourselves? In the next trap, the mind doesn't just assume it's normal, it assumes it's blameless. Self-serving bias. You ace a test. You tell yourself it's because you studied hard. because you're smart, because you deserved it. You fail the next one. You blame the teacher. The questions were unfair. You didn't get enough sleep. Anything but your own effort. That's the self-serving bias at work. The tendency to attribute our successes to internal factors like skill or effort and our failures to external ones like luck, timing, or other people. It's a built-in defense mechanism, a way to protect our self-esteem. When things go right, we claim credit. When they go wrong, we deflect blame. And it feels natural. The self-serving bias isn't about lying. It's about subtle distortion. Our memories get edited. Our explanations get rewritten. Slowly, without realizing it, we start to see ourselves as the hero in every success story and the victim in every failure. In relationships, it shows up when we say the other person was too demanding, never listening, always the problem. We overlook our own patterns. In the workplace, we take credit for team wins and blame the team for setbacks. In sports, we praise our discipline when we win and blame referees when we lose. It shows up in group dynamics too. Teams tend to internalize wins. We worked hard and externalize losses. The other team got lucky. This kind of bias makes reflection harder, growth slower, accountability rarer, and over time it skews our entire sense of identity. We build a self-image that feels strong but is brittle because it's not fully honest. We become allergic to criticism, defensive in the face of feedback. We can't learn from mistakes if we're always explaining them away. But the danger isn't just personal. On a societal scale, the self-serving bias feeds division. Politicians blame their opponents for every problem. Institutions avoid responsibility. Failures become someone else's fault. Progress stalls. The alternative is uncomfortable, but powerful. It's owning your part, even when it hurts. It's sitting with failure long enough to learn from it. It's saying, maybe I messed up, maybe I can do better. And it's noticing when the story in your head starts to shift, always in your favor. Because growth begins when that narrative is challenged. Self-worth doesn't come from always being right. It comes from being honest enough to see when you're wrong. And if we bend reality to protect our pride, what happens when that pride paints the future too? What happens when we don't just shield ourselves from blame, but from the possibility that anything could go wrong at all? Because in the next trap, the mind doesn't just protect its past. It assumes the future will go exactly as hoped. Optimism bias. You hear about a flood that destroyed homes in another city. You think, that wouldn't happen here. Your friend is diagnosed with a serious illness. You feel sympathy, but part of you thinks, that won't happen to me. You plan a project and assume everything will go smoothly. You take on a loan, imagining your future self will easily pay it off. You hear the statistics, divorce rates, business failures, health risks, but they feel like warnings meant for other people. This is the optimism bias, the belief that we are less likely to experience negative events and more likely to experience positive ones than other people. It's not just hope, it's an unconscious tilt in how we process risk, predict outcomes, and plan our lives. We expect better odds than the data justifies. We think we're exceptions. Studies show this bias is surprisingly consistent across age, culture, and background. People consistently underestimate their risk of getting sick, losing their job, or being in an accident. At the same time, they overestimate their likelihood of getting promoted, falling in love, or reaching their goals. Why does the mind do this? Because optimism feels good. It motivates action. It fuels ambition. It helps us recover from setbacks. In evolutionary terms, it likely helped us survive. Those who believed tomorrow would be better were more likely to keep moving toward it. But the same optimism that pushes us forward can also lead us astray. It causes people to undersave for retirement, to put off health screenings, to underestimate deadlines, overestimate willpower, and overlook red flags in relationships. It feeds speculative bubbles in finance and unrealistic policies in government. It convinces startups they'll be the exception. It encourages us to stretch, to risk, to leap without always seeing the fall. The optimism bias doesn't just affect individuals, it infects systems. Hospitals plan without enough beds. Cities build without flood protections. Businesses ignore recession models. Leaders discount warnings. It's not that optimism is bad, it's that unbalanced optimism blinds. There's a difference between being hopeful and being delusional. Hope accepts reality and works toward change. Optimism bias edits reality to fit the story we prefer. Awareness is the counterweight, asking, what if I'm wrong? What if things don't go as planned? What does the data say? Not just the dream. Because the future is uncertain, and while it might go better than expected, it might not. Planning for both outcomes isn't pessimism, it's preparation. And if our minds are so quick to assume the future will go well, what happens when we fall to the opposite illusion, when every forecast feels bleak, every outcome feels doomed, and caution turns to paralysis? Because in the next trap, the glass isn't half full. It's already spilled. Pessimism bias. You check the news, and it feels like the world is falling apart. Every headline is another reason to worry. Conflict, crisis, collapse. You scroll through social media and see people arguing, complaining, breaking down. The sense settles in your chest. Things are getting worse. Maybe they've always been bad. Maybe they'll never get better. That feeling. That's pessimism bias. The tendency to overestimate the likelihood, scale, and permanence of negative outcomes. It's the belief that bad things are more common, more serious, and more likely to affect us than the data suggests. Where optimism bias paints the future in soft light, pessimism bias dims it. It magnifies threats and shrinks possibilities, and it doesn't just change how we see the future, it changes how we feel in the present. This bias isn't just born from mood, it's reinforced by the world around us. Negative information is louder, more urgent, more viral. News media thrives on catastrophe. Social media favors outrage. Politics leverages fear. And our brains are wired to pay attention to danger because, evolutionarily, noticing the worst kept us alive. But over time, constant exposure to negativity shapes our worldview. We begin to believe that crime is always rising, even when it's falling, that people are more divided than they actually are, that opportunities are scarce and the odds are against us. We assume the worst, not because it's true, but because it's what we've been shown the most. Pessimism bias influences how we vote, how we spend, and how we dream. People delay having children because they believe the world is too unstable. They avoid investing because they fear recession. They don't apply for jobs or start projects because they've already imagined the worst-case outcome. And while caution is healthy, chronic pessimism becomes a cage. It shrinks horizons. It convinces us that trying is foolish, that hope is naive, that progress is a myth. But the data often tells a different story. On many metrics, global poverty, literacy, life expectancy, violence, the world has improved dramatically over decades. Yet many believe it's worse than ever. Not because of reality, but because of what we focus on. This bias also warps personal perception. A bad day feels like a bad life. A failed attempt feels like a dead end. A single rejection feels like proof of unworthiness. The danger of pessimism bias isn't just fear, it's paralysis. When we believe things can't improve, we stop trying. When we believe people can't change, we stop forgiving. When we believe nothing works, we stop building. The antidote isn't blind positivity. It's measured realism. It's asking, what do the facts say? What progress am I ignoring? What effort is still worth making? Because if we fall too deep into pessimism, we don't just misread the world, we retreat from it. And if our minds are this quick to assume the worst, what happens when we place more trust in people who look, think, and act like us, while quietly fearing or dismissing those outside our circle? Because in the next trap, the world doesn't just feel worse, it feels divided. and we're convinced our side is the only one worth believing in. In-group bias. You're at a sports game, and your team scores. You cheer wildly. The players are heroes. The fans around you feel like family. Moments later, the opposing team makes a great play. You call it lucky, or cheap, or unfair. That's in-group bias, the tendency to favor people we consider part of our own group, while judging outsiders more harshly. It's not just about sports, it's about identity. We all belong to groups, families, schools, nations, religions, political parties, online communities, even neighborhoods and fandoms, and once a group becomes ours, we start to see the world in terms of us and them. In-group bias leads us to view our group as more moral, more deserving, more trustworthy, even when we have no evidence. We interpret actions more generously. We forgive mistakes more easily. We assume good intent. Meanwhile, we scrutinize the out-group. We assume they're wrong, misguided, or even dangerous. Their flaws stand out. Their successes feel suspicious. Their perspectives seem biased. This bias has deep evolutionary roots. In early human history, group loyalty meant survival. Belonging meant protection. Strangers were threats. Our ancestors didn't have time to weigh nuance. Quick judgment kept them alive. But in today's world, this shortcut becomes a problem. In workplaces, in-group bias can lead to favoritism, unfair promotions, or blind spots in team dynamics. In schools, it can divide students by race, class, or interest. In politics, it turns disagreement into demonization. We begin to seek information that flatters our group and reject anything that might complicate the picture. We surround ourselves with people who agree with us. We interpret ambiguity in our group's favor and assign blame to others. Even in conflict, we minimize our side's role. We were defending ourselves. They started it. We're the ones who want peace. And it's not just about ideology. In-group bias can be based on something as arbitrary as a shirt color. In one classic experiment, researchers randomly divided people into groups. Despite the groups being meaningless, participants quickly began to show favoritism toward their own group and suspicion toward the other. The mind doesn't wait for good reasons to divide. It just needs a label. In-group bias makes the world feel smaller, safer, simpler. But it comes at a cost. It narrows empathy. It weakens collaboration. It turns strangers into enemies and allies into absolutes. The antidote is curiosity. It's stepping outside our circle and asking, what if their story makes sense too? It's seeing individuals before categories and noticing when we give our group the benefit of the doubt but deny it to others. Because if the mind so quickly favors its own, what happens when it starts assuming everyone outside that circle is exactly the same? In the next trap, we don't just favor our group, we flatten theirs. Out-group homogeneity bias. You hear someone say, they're all the same. Maybe they're talking about a political group, or a generation, or a culture. The details don't matter. The assumption is the same. Everyone in that other group thinks the same, acts the same, is the same. That's out-group homogeneity bias. The belief that members of other groups are more alike than they really are, while members of our own group are seen as diverse, nuanced, and individual. It's not just ignorance. It's a built-in distortion in how we process identity. We look at people outside our circle and flatten them. We say they instead of he or she. We assign them one mind, one motive, one flaw. Meanwhile, we see our own group as complex. We know that not all of us agree, that some of us are kind, and some are cruel, that we come in shades. But them, they're a monolith. This bias shows up in politics, religion, race, nationality, even fandoms, professions, or rival schools. Ask a sports fan to describe their own team, and you'll get a range of personalities. Ask them to describe the rival team's fans, and it's often just one word: arrogant, aggressive, obnoxious. In studies, participants are shown photos of people from various ethnic or social groups and later asked to identify them. People are consistently more accurate at recognizing faces from their own group. Faces from outgroups blur together. We literally struggle to see the difference. The mind groups for efficiency. It uses labels to save energy. But when those labels become walls, we stop looking closely. We stop listening carefully. We lose the ability to see humanity in the other side. Outgroup homogeneity bias leads to stereotyping. It justifies prejudice. It hardens tribal lines. It convinces us that negotiation is pointless because they won't change. It convinces us that understanding is impossible because they wouldn't understand us. And it feeds fear, because what is more frightening than a group of people who all believe the same thing, want the same thing, and stand against you with a single face? But it's not true. Every group is a crowd of contradictions. Every ideology has debate. Every culture has rebels and reformers. Every they is made up of me's. The only way to see that is to stop looking from a distance, to step closer, to talk, to ask questions, to listen longer. Because when we stop flattening others, we start expanding ourselves. And if we fail to see the diversity in other groups, what happens when people start to internalize the narrow labels assigned to them? When their performance is shaped not by their ability, but by the fear of confirming a stereotype. Because in the next trap, we don't just misjudge others, we begin to alter ourselves to fit the judgments we fear. Stereotype threat. A student sits down for a math test. Before it begins, she overhears a comment, "Girls usually don't do well on this section." It's said casually, maybe even jokingly, but now a quiet weight settles on her shoulders. She starts the exam and struggles. Not because she lacks skill, but because a part of her mind is no longer focused on solving problems. It's watching her own performance, afraid it might confirm the stereotype. This is stereotype threat, a psychological phenomenon where awareness of a negative stereotype about your group causes anxiety, reduces performance, and reinforces the very thing you're trying to disprove. It doesn't require overt discrimination. It doesn't even require believing the stereotype. Just being reminded of it is enough to activate the threat. Studies have shown that when students are subtly reminded of their race or gender before an exam, their performance can drop, especially if there's a stereotype tied to their identity and the task at hand. Black students score lower on standardized tests when asked to indicate their race beforehand. Women perform worse on spatial tasks when gender is mentioned. Older adults recall fewer words when told memory declines with age. The mind, under pressure, shifts from doing to defending. It becomes hyper-aware. It tries harder not to succeed, but not to fail. Not to prove the stereotype wrong, but to avoid proving it right. And that effort splits attention, drains working memory, and amplifies doubt. It's like running a race while glancing constantly over your shoulder, hoping no one sees you stumble. Stereotype threat is not about weakness. It's about being watched, being reduced to a symbol instead of a self. It's about navigating an invisible tension, performing under suspicion. And it doesn't just affect performance, it affects identity. People start avoiding domains associated with the threat. Girls steer away from math. Minorities withdraw from academia. Older adults stop challenging their memory, not because they can't, but because the stereotype says they shouldn't. Over time, the threat becomes a prophecy, not because it's true, but because the pressure to avoid it becomes unbearable. But it's not inevitable. The antidotes are small but powerful. Changing how tasks are framed, emphasizing that tests measure learning, not innate ability, can reduce the effect. Creating identity-safe environments where people feel seen as individuals, not representatives of a group, restores focus. Encouraging self-affirmation before a challenge helps people anchor their sense of self. Because when you stop carrying the weight of a stereotype, your mind returns to what it was built to do. Think clearly, move freely, and perform without fear. And if belief can shape performance under pressure, what happens when belief alone can heal, energize, or even create real physical change? Because in the next trap, we don't just fear a false story, we begin to heal from one. Placebo effect. A patient is given a white pill and told it will ease their pain. The pill contains no active ingredients, but hours later, the pain subsides. This is not deception. It's not imagination. It's the placebo effect, a remarkable phenomenon where belief alone can trigger real physical or psychological change. At its core, the placebo effect reveals how powerful the mind is in shaping experience. It doesn't mean the illness was fake. It means the body responded to expectation. The brain released real chemicals, pain signals diminished. Symptoms eased, hope turned into healing. Placebos can come in many forms: sugar pills, saline injections, sham surgeries. In clinical trials, they are used as controls to see how a real drug performs against the power of belief, and often the results are stunning. In some studies, placebos outperform actual treatments, especially for conditions shaped by perception, pain, fatigue, nausea, depression, anxiety. The more elaborate the placebo, the stronger the effect. A pill works better if it's branded. A syringe works better than a capsule. 2 pills are better than 1. A white coat and confident tone enhance the outcome. The ritual matters as much as the substance. It's not that people are faking. Their bodies change. Their symptoms ease. Brain scans show different patterns. Neurotransmitters fire. The body reacts to the story it's told. But it's not just about medicine. The placebo effect shows up in performance. Athletes run faster after taking what they believe is a performance enhancer, even if it's inert. Students perform better on tests if they believe they've been trained in special techniques. People sleep better when told their rest was optimal, even when it wasn't. This phenomenon isn't just about the mind tricking the body. It's about how belief, expectation, and context alter physiology. The brain, anticipating relief or improvement, activates real mechanisms. Belief becomes biology. The placebo effect also reminds us of something deeper: how much healing is social. A reassuring voice, a familiar setting, the sense of being cared for. These factors can change outcomes. The messenger is as important as the message. But this power has a shadow. Because if belief can heal, it can also harm. If hope can soothe pain, fear can create it. If expectation can lift symptoms, it can also induce them. And that leads to the next phenomenon, where the mind doesn't imagine wellness, but sickness, where the body doesn't respond to a remedy, but to a warning. Because in the next trap, the placebo isn't sugar-coated. It's poisoned by belief. Nocebo effect. A patient takes a harmless pill, but is warned it may cause headaches, nausea, or dizziness. Hours later, they begin to feel ill. Their head pounds, their stomach turns, their breath shortens. The pill was inert, but the symptoms are real. This is the nocebo effect, the darker sibling of the placebo effect. Where the placebo heals through positive expectation, the nocebo harms through negative belief. The word comes from Latin, I shall harm, and that's exactly what happens, not through chemicals but through fear, suggestion, and anticipation. The body responds to a story of danger, and in doing so, creates it. In clinical trials, patients who receive sugar pills often report side effects because they were told what those side effects might be. In some cases, they experience the very symptoms caused by the real drug. Not because of chemistry, but because the mind expects to suffer. The effect can be triggered by a warning label, a passing comment, a memory, or even a diagnosis delivered without care. In one famous study, patients with lactose intolerance were given a lactose-free drink, but told it might trigger symptoms. Many developed bloating, discomfort, and pain, not from milk, from meaning. The nocebo effect isn't imagined. It's biological. Expectation alters perception. Anxiety activates stress responses. Cortisol levels rise. Pain sensitivity increases. Nerves fire differently. The brain interprets ordinary sensations as signs of illness, and the effect is self-reinforcing. Once symptoms appear, they confirm the fear. Something is wrong, we think. The spiral tightens. We monitor ourselves more closely. We brace. We tense. We suffer. In medicine, this creates a challenge. How do you warn patients of potential side effects without causing them? Doctors must navigate the thin line between informed consent and induced harm. A cold, clinical explanation may trigger fear. A thoughtful, compassionate one may reduce it. But the Nocebo effect doesn't stop in hospitals. It leaks into everyday life. You're told your job is at risk, and soon feel chest pain. You read an article about a virus and develop its symptoms. You believe your food was undercooked, and your stomach tightens. Your body becomes a canvas painted by worry. And in societies shaped by distrust, bad news, and worst-case scenarios, the Nocebo effect can become collective. A community convinced they're under threat may experience more illness, more fatigue, more decline. The body of the group mirrors the fear of its parts. The lesson isn't to avoid warnings, it's to examine how we carry them, how we frame risk, how we explain danger, how we prepare people to face the unknown without shrinking beneath it. Because belief can wound, language can harm, and stories told carelessly can become scripts that the body follows. And if fear can conjure symptoms from nothing, what happens when vague, flattering, feel-good words convince us that a generic description was written just for us? Because in the next trap, the message isn't threatening. It's eerily accurate until we look closer. Forer effect. You open a horoscope app. It tells you, you have a great need for others to like and admire you. You have a tendency to be critical of yourself. While you have some weaknesses, you are generally able to compensate for them. You nod. It feels uncanny. How could it know you so well? But then you learn everyone else received the same description. That's the Forer effect, a psychological phenomenon where people believe vague, general personality statements are highly accurate when they think those statements are tailored specifically to them. It's named after psychologist Bertram R. Forer, who in 1948 gave his students a personality test. A week later, he handed back a personal analysis to each of them and asked them to rate its accuracy from 0 to 5. The average score, 4.26. The twist? Every student received the exact same text. The Forer effect is sometimes called the Barnum Effect, named after the showman P.T. Barnum, who allegedly said, "There's a sucker born every minute." But while Barnum's legacy evokes trickery, the Forer effect reveals something deeper, our hunger to be seen. We crave insight into ourselves. And when someone offers us a mirror, even a foggy one, we lean in, we interpret vague statements through the lens of our personal experiences. We fill in blanks. We complete the portrait ourselves. You have a hidden potential. We recall a time we surprised ourselves. You sometimes feel insecure in large groups. We remember that awkward party. You have a unique way of looking at the world. Of course we do. The trick lies in the phrasing. Forer-style statements are broad but emotionally charged. They balance positives and negatives. They offer compliments wrapped in relatability. They sound precise but contain enough ambiguity to apply to almost anyone. And the illusion deepens when there's context, an astrology chart, a personality quiz, a career assessment. When we trust the source, we trust the message. But this has consequences. The Forer effect makes us vulnerable to manipulation. Marketers use it in ads. Scam psychics rely on it for readings. Pseudosciences thrive on it. People believe in systems that feel accurate, not because they are, but because they're designed to feel that way. It also affects how we judge others. We accept personality summaries at face value. We overlook the complexity of people. We stop asking deeper questions. The Forer effect teaches us that accuracy and resonance are not the same. Just because something feels true doesn't mean it's true. It means it was written to feel that way. And if vague affirmations can feel personal, what happens when the illusion is scaled up? When an entire group of people are fed descriptions so broad they apply to everyone, but presented as special insights meant just for them. Because in the next trap, we don't just feel seen. We're swept up in a show built for everyone and sold as magic just for us. Barnum Effect. A stranger tells you, you're the kind of person who can be outgoing at times, but also deeply introspective. You like to be independent, but value connection. You're capable of great things, but sometimes you doubt yourself. It feels specific, personal, almost like they've known you for years. But they haven't, and they could say the same thing to almost anyone. This is the Barnum Effect, the tendency to accept general, vague statements as uniquely accurate when they're framed as being tailored just for us. It's closely related to the Forer effect, but there's a subtle difference worth noting. The Forer effect arises in controlled settings, psychological experiments that reveal how easily people believe a randomized personality summary describes them. The Barnum effect, named after showman P.T. Barnum, applies this insight more broadly to the real world, where mass messaging, entertainment, and marketing turn vague affirmations into tools of persuasion. If the Forer effect is the cognitive flaw, the Barnum effect is its performance. Barnum's statements are the emotional bait behind horoscopes, fortune cookies, tarot readings, personality tests, and political speeches. They're the lines that sound profound, but apply to almost everyone. You have a deep well of untapped potential. You value honesty, but don't always speak your mind. You've been through things that few understand. They flatter. They feel insightful. They're structured to resonate without revealing anything concrete. Marketers use them to sell lifestyles. Gurus use them to sell programs. Charismatic leaders use them to create the illusion of deep understanding. The Barnum effect builds false intimacy. It makes an audience feel seen, even when nothing personal has been said. And the more we want to believe, the more convincing it becomes. It works not just because it flatters, but because it avoids specifics. Ambiguity gives room for projection. We fill in the blanks with our own stories. The illusion of insight is actually a mirror. The words mean little, but the meaning we assign to them is powerful. This has consequences. It makes us vulnerable to manipulation. It makes pseudoscience feel scientific. It makes empty advice feel life-changing. It encourages us to trust sources that validate us without challenging us. It floods social media with content that sounds wise but says nothing. And worst of all, it numbs our critical thinking. We stop asking, is this true? And settle for, does this feel true? But wisdom doesn't just resonate. It reveals, it challenges, it clarifies. And if our minds are this eager to believe in depth where there is none, what happens when we start to judge people's entire worth based on just one trait? When beauty, charisma, or one moment of charm makes someone seem good in every way. Because in the next trap, the illusion isn't built on vagueness. It's built on the glow of a single feature that blinds us to everything else. Halo effect. You meet someone at a party. They're attractive, well-dressed, and speak with confidence. Before you even know much about them, you assume they're probably smart, kind, successful, trustworthy. You're not sure why, but they just seem like the kind of person who has it all together. That's the halo effect, a cognitive bias where our overall impression of someone, often based on a single positive trait, influences how we perceive their character, intelligence, or worth. It's not rational, but it's powerful. A halo forms around one standout feature, often something superficial, like physical attractiveness, social charm, or a confident voice, and that glow spills into other areas. We assume someone who looks good must also be good in other ways. This effect isn't just about people. It colors how we perceive products, companies, institutions, even countries. A brand that delivers beautiful packaging gets rated as more effective. A school with impressive architecture is seen as more prestigious. A celebrity who's beloved in movies is trusted when they endorse political causes. Our minds crave simplicity. We'd rather assume consistency than complexity. So when we see one strong signal, we extrapolate a whole character. In education, this affects grading. Teachers who see a neat, enthusiastic student may rate their work more favorably. In the workplace, an employee who impresses in meetings may be seen as more competent overall, even if their performance is average. In courtrooms, studies have shown that attractive defendants are more likely to receive lighter sentences. The bias bleeds into justice, into hiring, into leadership selection, into who gets the benefit of the doubt. The danger isn't just misjudgment, it's misallocation. Talented individuals may be overlooked because they lack polish. Mediocre ones may rise quickly because they make a strong first impression. Entire systems become skewed toward surface over substance. And the person under the halo, they may struggle too. They're expected to live up to an image that wasn't real to begin with. Their flaws surprise people more. Their mistakes seem inconsistent. The pedestal becomes a pressure. The halo effect is why charisma can override ethics, why we trust the charming over the competent, why we mistake likability for reliability. But people are not reflections of a single trait. No one is all good or all bad. Seeing clearly means learning to isolate the trait that impressed us and asking whether it really tells us anything about the rest. Because if the glow of one trait can make someone seem better than they are, what happens when one flaw does the opposite? In the next trap, the halo becomes a shadow, and one perceived weakness distorts everything we think we see. Horn effect. You meet someone new. They show up late, seem distracted, and don't make eye contact. Instantly, you form an impression: rude, unreliable, maybe even arrogant. Later, you learn they were running from a family emergency, but the impression stuck. This is the horn effect, the inverse of the halo effect, where one negative trait, often unrelated to a person's actual character or ability, clouds our entire judgment of them. Instead of seeing complexity, we see flaw. A single trait becomes the lens through which we view everything else. A grumpy expression becomes a selfish personality. A nervous laugh becomes dishonesty. A fashion choice becomes a sign of incompetence. We connect dots that were never meant to form a picture. The horn effect doesn't stop at individuals. It extends to brands, professions, communities, even countries. A bad first impression becomes the whole story. A single negative headline taints an entire organization. One awkward sentence discredits an otherwise thoughtful idea. It happens fast. The brain is wired to detect threats, and when we sense something off, we often don't stop to ask why. We assume intention. We make the flaw feel bigger than it is. In education, a student who struggles early may be seen as less capable overall. In the workplace, someone who is quiet in meetings might be labeled disengaged. In leadership, one mistake can eclipse a history of success. This bias makes it hard to separate performance from perception. It creates cycles of judgment. Once someone is seen in a negative light, their actions are interpreted through suspicion. Even neutral or positive behavior is discounted. And the person under the shadow, they feel it. They may try harder to prove themselves, but their efforts are ignored. They may retreat or underperform, fulfilling the expectation. Over time, the horn effect becomes not just a misjudgment, but a self-fulfilling prophecy. The damage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a missed opportunity. A conversation never started. A promotion never offered. A voice never heard. Like the halo effect, the horn effect thrives in first impressions. But while halos lift people up, horns weigh them down. Breaking the bias means pausing before we generalize. It means noticing when we've let a single trait hijack the story. It means asking, if this person had impressed me, would I still interpret this behavior the same way? Because one flaw doesn't define a person, but our tendency to treat it that way can define how we treat them. And if we can give someone too little credit based on a flaw, what happens when we give someone too much credit simply because of a title? Because in the next trap, authority replaces evidence, and expertise becomes a shortcut to truth, whether it's earned or not. Appeal to authority. You hear someone speak with confidence. They use the right vocabulary, wear the right suit, stand behind the right podium. And you believe them, not because of the strength of their evidence, but because of the strength of their title. This is the appeal to authority, not just a logical fallacy, but a psychological reflex. The tendency to accept a claim as true because it comes from someone we perceive as an expert, regardless of whether their expertise is relevant or their claim is sound. It doesn't begin with logic. It begins with trust. From childhood, we're trained to listen to those in charge: parents, teachers, doctors, bosses. Authority means guidance. It means protection. In uncertain situations, our minds crave direction, and experts offer that in polished, practiced tones. But the problem begins when authority is mistaken for accuracy, when the source overshadows the content. Studies show people are more likely to agree with a statement if it's attributed to someone with credentials, even if the content is flawed. We defer to scientists outside their field. We believe celebrities when they endorse health claims. We assume a best-selling author is also a moral thinker. A powerful CEO must be a wise leader. A charismatic professor must be right. Even the appearance of authority triggers compliance. A lab coat, a uniform, a verified social media badge. The deeper the symbols, the stronger the effect. The appeal to authority also activates group loyalty. We trust people who represent our team, our ideology, our side. And once someone earns our trust, we often stop scrutinizing what they say. This bias doesn't just live in others, it lives in us. We quote articles without reading them. We repeat statistics we half remember. We cite names to silence debate, not because we've verified the truth, but because it feels safer to echo someone who sounds like they've already done the work. But real expertise is not just about confidence. It's about humility, clarity, willingness to say, I don't know. True experts encourage questions. They cite evidence. They welcome challenge. The appeal to authority becomes dangerous when it replaces thinking with obedience, when it shuts down inquiry, when it becomes a shield used to silence dissent or a tool to manipulate belief. We don't need to reject authority, but we need to remember that no title, no matter how shiny, makes someone infallible. And if we trust a claim because someone important said it, what happens when someone says nothing at all? Because in the next trap, truth isn't assumed because of who speaks. It's assumed because no one has proven it false. Appeal to ignorance. A claim is made. There's no proof that aliens don't exist, so they must be out there. Another, no one's ever proven this medicine doesn't work, so it must help. This is the appeal to ignorance, not just a logical error, but a psychological impulse. The assumption that if we lack evidence to disprove something, it must be true, or conversely, if no one has proven it true, it must be false. At its heart, this bias emerges from discomfort. Humans struggle with uncertainty. We want resolution. When there's a gap in knowledge, we rush to fill it, not with data, but with belief. And belief, when unchallenged, often feels like truth. The mind prefers clean conclusions. We don't know is unsettling. Ambiguity feels dangerous, so the absence of evidence becomes a blank canvas where we draw the answers we want. If we fear something, we assume the worst. If we hope for something, we assume the best. In medical debates, this shows up when a treatment with no proven benefit is embraced simply because no one has yet disproven it. In politics, it appears when rumors thrive due to lack of confirmation either way. In daily life, it happens when we assume motives, intentions, or causes just because there's no solid proof against them. The internet magnifies this effect. Misinformation thrives not because it's convincing, but because it's unchallenged. If no one has publicly debunked a viral claim, it gains traction. Silence is mistaken for support. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, nor is it proof of presence. It's just silence. And silence should be a signal to pause, not a license to believe. The appeal to ignorance also taps into fear. When we don't understand something, we imagine dangers. A mysterious symptom becomes a serious illness. A strange noise becomes a threat. Our brains evolved to assume danger in the unknown. Better to overreact and survive than underreact and suffer. But in the modern world, this bias misfires. It leads to conspiracy theories, unfounded accusations, unproven remedies, and rigid thinking. It turns gaps into convictions, uncertainty into certainty. The truth is, not everything unknown must be filled in. Not every question has an answer yet. Sometimes, the most honest position is we don't know. And that's not a weakness. It's wisdom. Because when we fill gaps with guesses, we build our beliefs on silence, and silence doesn't support weight for long. And if we let absence of disproof become our reason for belief, what happens when belief is based not on silence, but volume? When the number of people who believe becomes the proof itself? Because in the next trap, truth isn't found in facts. It's found in the crowd. Bandwagon Effect. You open your feed and see everyone talking about a new trend, a new stock, a new belief. At first you're unsure, then you see more people join in, liking, sharing, endorsing. Slowly your hesitation turns into curiosity. Maybe they're onto something. Maybe you should join too. This is the bandwagon effect, the psychological tendency to adopt beliefs, behaviors, or trends simply because many others have done so. The more people who believe something, the more believable it feels. At its core, this bias is about belonging. Agreement feels safe, conformity feels comfortable. When we see a crowd moving in one direction, we assume they know something we don't. Doubt fades. The crowd becomes evidence. The bandwagon effect is not about facts. It's about momentum. Ideas pick up speed, not because they're right, but because they're visible. In marketing, it shows up in phrases like best-selling, most popular, or trending now. When we see others buying a product, we're more likely to trust it, not because of its quality, but because of its adoption. In politics, it can sway elections. When polls show a leading candidate, undecided voters often lean toward the front runner. In social media, a post with thousands of likes feels more valid than one with a few, even if the content is identical. The bandwagon effect amplifies virality. Once an idea starts to spread, its growth accelerates. More attention draws more belief. More belief attracts more believers. Soon, the idea feels inevitable, even if it's fragile. But the crowd isn't always right. History is full of popular ideas that turned out to be wrong. Mass panics, market bubbles, moral panics. From witch hunts to speculative crashes, the bandwagon effect has driven societies into error, fear, and chaos, not because the ideas made sense, but because they spread quickly. This bias also pressures silence. When everyone seems to agree, it's harder to dissent. People self-censor to avoid conflict. Nuance is lost. Questioning becomes rebellion. And so the bandwagon grows, not through persuasion, but through pressure. But truth doesn't depend on numbers, and reality doesn't become real just because it's popular. Resisting the bandwagon effect means asking, do I believe this because I've thought it through, or because I've seen it repeated? Am I agreeing because it's right, or because it's easy? Because what's popular today may vanish tomorrow, and what's unpopular now may be the truth that lasts. And if we let the crowd convince us something is true, what happens when we use a single example to convince ourselves that it always is? Because in the next trap, belief doesn't come from many voices. It comes from one echoed too quickly and judged too soon. Hasty generalization. You try one dish at a new restaurant. It's awful. You decide the entire menu must be bad. A tourist has a rude encounter with one local. They go home and say, people in that city are unfriendly. A news story reports a teenager committing a crime. Suddenly, people are saying, what's wrong with kids these days? This is hasty generalization, the cognitive trap, where we take a small sample and apply it too broadly, drawing sweeping conclusions from limited, biased, or unrepresentative data. At its root, this isn't about logic, it's about speed. The brain wants to understand the world quickly. It grabs onto an experience, an anecdote, a statistic, and stretches it into a rule, even if it doesn't deserve to be one. We see one, we believe many. The danger lies in how natural it feels. The story we experience is more vivid than the statistics we don't. One dramatic incident outweighs 1,000 quiet counterexamples. One bad apple, one bad date, one bad day, and we start to write rules that reshape how we think, act, and relate. This bias shows up in everyday conversation. All politicians are corrupt. Men are like that. Millennials are entitled. Doctors don't listen. It often begins with something real, but turns into something false. In media, hasty generalizations fuel stereotypes. A single case gets magnified and repeated until it seems universal. One type of person becomes a caricature. One crime becomes a trend. One failure becomes a prophecy. It also creeps into science and research. A single study on a small group gets reported as a major finding. A cherry-picked quote becomes a universal truth. In business, one customer complaint becomes a reason to overhaul a whole system. In relationships, one misstep becomes a pattern. Why do we do it? Because generalizations offer control. They let us feel like we understand people, like we've predicted the future, like we've identified danger. But quick judgment often leads to bad judgment. The solution isn't to distrust every impression. It's to pause. To ask, how many examples do I have? Are they typical? Have I looked for counterexamples? Because the mind is quick to leap from some to all, from once to always, from this to everything. And when we make patterns where none exist, we don't just misjudge others, we miss the chance to understand them. And if we're willing to generalize based on one sample, what happens when we draw the target after we've fired the shots? Because in the next trap, it's not that we're fooled by randomness. It's that we force meaning onto it and call the coincidence proof. Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy. A man fires a gun at the side of a barn, random, scattered shots. Then he walks up and draws a target around the tightest cluster of bullet holes. From a distance, it looks like he has incredible aim. This is the Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy, where random data is cherry-picked and framed to support a desired conclusion. It's the illusion of pattern in noise, the appearance of precision, born not from accuracy, but from rearranging the facts after the fact. It doesn't just fool others, it fools ourselves. This fallacy isn't about lying, it's about misinterpreting chance as meaning. The mind is wired to find patterns even where none exist. A few coincidences, a few similarities, a few overlaps, and we convince ourselves there's a signal. We draw the target after we've seen the results. In science, this leads to misleading studies. Researchers test multiple hypotheses, but only report the one that produced an interesting result, ignoring the rest. The significant finding is highlighted, while the failures are buried. What looks like discovery is sometimes just statistical luck. In business, it appears when companies highlight a few successful outcomes from a strategy, while ignoring the many that failed. It turns flukes into proof. In medicine, patients may try multiple treatments and credit the one they were using when they improved, never questioning coincidence. It's not just professional. We do it in everyday life. We remember the times we predicted something and forget the times we were wrong. We link two events, a full moon and a bad night of sleep, a gut feeling and a win, and call it intuition. We highlight the moments that confirm our beliefs and edit out the rest. The fallacy is named after a story, but it lives in statistics, storytelling, superstition, and bias. It's a cousin to confirmation bias, a sibling to cherry-picking, a reflection of how eager we are to wrap randomness in a narrative. The danger is subtle. Once a pattern is found, it resists scrutiny. It feels real. It becomes a reference point. Other data is interpreted through it. And because it was built to look perfect, it's hard to shake. The tighter the cluster, the more convincing the target. But the real question is not whether a pattern exists. It's whether it would have stood out if we weren't looking for it. The cure is humility. It's remembering that chance is messy, that correlation isn't causation, that randomness can mimic intention, and sometimes what looks meaningful is just noise in a clever disguise. And if we're this quick to mistake coincidence for meaning, what happens when we're asked to choose between gains and losses, only to find that our decisions don't follow logic at all? Because in the next trap, the mind doesn't just see patterns in the past. It bends value in the present and risks more to avoid loss than to win. Prospect theory. You're given a choice. Option A, a guaranteed gain of $900. Option B, a 90% chance to win $1,000 and a 10% chance to win nothing. Most people choose the sure thing. We prefer certainty over risk when it comes to gains. Now flip it. Option A, a guaranteed loss of $900. Option B, a 90% chance to lose $1,000 and a 10% chance to lose nothing. Now, most people take the risk. This is prospect theory, one of the most influential ideas in behavioral economics. Developed by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, it describes how we actually make decisions under uncertainty, not with perfect logic, but with deep psychological distortions around how we perceive value, loss, and risk. According to classical economics, people make rational choices to maximize expected utility, but real people don't behave that way. Prospect theory shows that we don't treat all outcomes equally. We are risk-averse when it comes to gains and risk-seeking when it comes to losses. We hate losing more than we like winning. This is called loss aversion, a core principle within prospect theory. The pain of losing $100 is stronger than the joy of gaining $100. This imbalance drives many of our decisions, often against our best interests. It's why investors hold on to failing stocks. Why gamblers double down after a loss. Why people fear change that might bring gain, simply because it risks something familiar. But it goes deeper. Prospect theory also explains how we perceive value relative to a reference point, not in absolute terms. The same $20 can feel like a gift or an insult, depending on context. Winning $50 feels good, unless we expected $100. Then it feels like a loss. Our emotions aren't tied to outcomes. They're tied to expectations. And we're not consistent. We overweight small probabilities, fearing plane crashes, hoping for lottery wins. We underweight large ones, neglecting real risks and dismissing likely outcomes. We're irrational, not because we're broken, but because our decision-making was shaped for survival in a very different world. In modern life, these distortions show up everywhere: pricing strategies, insurance plans, political messaging, product design. They influence negotiations, savings behavior, health decisions. Even when we know what's logical, we often choose based on how options are framed, not on what they truly offer. Prospect theory doesn't just describe a flaw. It reveals a map, a deeply human pattern in how we trade certainty for hope and endure risk to escape regret. And if our minds bend value depending on context, what happens when we create mental ledgers that treat identical dollars as entirely different? Because in the next trap, we don't just feel gains and losses unevenly. We assign meaning to money depending on where it came from and where it's meant to go. Mental accounting. You receive $100 as a birthday gift. It feels like free money, so you treat yourself. That same week, you receive $100 from a client for freelance work. You hesitate before spending it. Maybe it should go into savings. Same amount, different feeling. This is mental accounting, a cognitive bias where we treat money differently depending on its source, intended use, or emotional context, even though money is objectively interchangeable. It's not about math, it's about meaning. In theory, every dollar is the same, but in practice, we sort them into psychological buckets. Gift money goes to fun, salary goes to bills. Bonuses feel like play money, tax refunds feel like windfalls. Lottery winnings become adventures, and losses. We isolate them, hide them, pretend they don't affect the bigger picture. This mental compartmentalization helps us organize our financial lives, but it also creates irrational behaviors. We splurge on vacation even when in debt at home. We tip more generously with casino winnings. We drive across town to save $10 on a $30 toaster, but not on a $1,000 TV. We invest aggressively in our fun money portfolio while playing it safe with our real investments. We may even refuse to spend gift cards on essentials, even if we're short on rent. Mental accounting makes us feel in control. It creates structure in an abstract world. But that structure can be misleading. Because money doesn't care where it came from. But we do. We feel more justified spending money earned through effort than money that feels accidental. We take greater risks with found money. We separate our finances emotionally, which can help with budgeting, but also lead to missed opportunities, wasted resources, and financial blind spots. This bias also shapes how we handle losses. If we lose money at the casino, we often keep gambling to win it back, as if the original loss sits in its own account. We fail to see that all money won, lost, or earned exists in the same system. We just don't feel it that way. Marketers and retailers exploit this bias. Sales are framed as savings rather than spending. Loyalty points feel like free currency. Discounts on luxury items are pitched as too good to pass up, even if we wouldn't have bought the item otherwise. The illusion of separate accounts lets us rationalize behaviors we'd question if we saw our finances as one pool. The antidote is awareness, asking if this money came from a different source, would I treat it the same? If this expense came from another account, would I justify it the same way? Because true financial clarity doesn't just come from numbers, it comes from noticing how those numbers feel. And if we're this prone to creating artificial categories, what happens when we try to spread our bets across them, thinking we're being smart when we're actually being simplistic? Because in the next trap, our attempt to play it safe leads us not to balance, but to illusion. Naive diversification. You walk into a buffet without thinking too hard. You grab a little bit of everything. A spoonful here, a slice there. Some of it you love, some of it you don't even recognize. But it feels right to fill the plate this way. This is naive diversification, the tendency to spread our choices broadly without strategic thought, assuming that variety alone creates balance. In theory, diversification is wise. In investing, it reduces risk. In planning, it guards against uncertainty. The phrase, "don't put all your eggs in one basket," captures this principle well. But naive diversification is something else. It's diversification without understanding. We choose based on a rule of thumb. A bit of everything must be better than too much of one. We divide evenly instead of wisely. We confuse spread with safety. This bias shows up in retirement plans. When employees are offered a mix of funds, many split their contributions evenly across all options, regardless of what those options actually are. If the plan includes risky stocks and stable bonds, they'll still allocate 50-50. If new, unfamiliar funds are added, the balance shifts again, not because of changed goals, but because of changed options. In consumer behavior, it's the person who buys 3 different cereals just to be safe or selects one of every menu item when uncertain. In time management, it's scheduling a variety of tasks each day without considering their importance. In decision-making, it's picking a little from every option to avoid the discomfort of choosing wrong. Why do we do this? Because choice is stressful, and committing to a single path feels risky. Spreading our decisions gives the illusion of security. It feels objective. It avoids regret. We believe that balance, even if superficial, will protect us. But naive diversification can dilute value. It can lead to suboptimal results. By trying not to choose poorly, we often avoid choosing wisely. It also arises from fairness. We want to treat all options equally, even when they aren't. If asked to divide resources, time, or attention, we lean towards symmetry. Everyone gets the same. Every task gets a slice. But sometimes, fairness doesn't mean equality. It means relevance. In finance, naive diversification can expose investors to hidden risks. In life, it can spread us thin across goals that don't all matter equally. The desire to do a little of everything can prevent us from doing what really matters. The solution isn't to avoid variety, it's to understand it, to ask, why am I choosing this? What outcome am I optimizing for? Am I spreading out of strategy or fear? Because the illusion of balance isn't the same as real protection. And if we're this prone to spreading without strategy, what happens when we also choose when to risk and when to play it safe, based not on logic but emotion? Because in the next trap, we don't just mix our options. We mix our courage and our caution depending on how the choice is framed. Risk aversion versus risk-seeking. You're standing at a cliff's edge. Below is opportunity or danger. You've been told there's a way to cross safely, a bridge with ropes. Some say it's secure, others say it sways. In your hand, you hold a ladder, flimsy but familiar. Do you trust the bridge or cling to what you know? This is the invisible calculus of risk, not on paper, in the gut. Risk aversion and risk-seeking aren't cold economic theories. They're emotional reflexes shaped by experience, memory, identity, and fear. They define how we move through life, when we leap, when we hesitate, when we retreat. Risk aversion whispers in subtle tones, don't ruin what you have, don't tempt fate, stay where it's safe. It lives in people who choose a steady paycheck over a volatile dream. In couples who stay in okay relationships rather than face the unknown. In those who silence their creativity to protect their routine. But risk-seeking is just as human. It's the pulse that drives explorers to uncharted waters. The thrill behind quitting a job to start a business. The gambler's rush. The artist who dares to fail. Risk-seeking shows up not as recklessness, but as a refusal to be caged by certainty. These tendencies shift with context. A single person may fear public speaking, but skydives on weekends, may dread emotional vulnerability, but invest in volatile markets. Our risk appetite is not a trait, it's a terrain. And the terrain is shaped by stories. Childhoods spent watching caution be rewarded tend to build risk-averse minds. Families built on survival, not surplus, learn to protect what little they have. Others grow up on boldness, taught that nothing ventured means nothing gained. Trauma tilts the equation. One bad experience with trust, and suddenly all relationships feel dangerous. One failure in front of others, and risk becomes shame. Risk-seeking isn't always courage. Sometimes it's numbness, and risk aversion isn't always prudence. Sometimes it's fear dressed as wisdom. We also respond to timing. When we feel in control, we take risks. When we feel desperate, we gamble. The same decision feels different depending on whether we're rising or falling. Society celebrates both impulses. We idolize entrepreneurs for risking it all. We admire savers for playing the long game. We praise bravery. We reward caution. But in truth, neither approach is right or wrong. What matters is knowing what you're risking and why. Are you avoiding a risk because it truly leads to harm, or because it threatens your comfort? Are you chasing danger because it leads to growth, or because safety feels like stagnation? Risk aversion and risk-seeking are not opposites. They are languages we speak depending on the season we're in. And the more fluent we become, the better we can decide when to hold the line and when to cross it. And so we come to the end of this journey through the strange and subtle traps of the mind, biases that shape not just what we think, but how we think. If any of these reflections made you pause, made you question, or made you see yourself a little more clearly, that's the point. Understanding these patterns doesn't mean we escape them entirely, but it does give us a map. And sometimes, knowing there's a map is enough to change the direction we walk. If you'd like to keep exploring these deeper layers of thought, where psychology meets philosophy and logic meets emotion, consider subscribing. It helps this channel grow, and it makes sure you're here for the next long conversation. If something in this video resonated or challenged you, leave a comment. I'd love to hear how these ideas show up in your life. And if you found value in this, a like helps more people find it too. Thank you, truly, for spending your time here. Until next time, stay curious.